All right, looks like we are live, and I want to welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host and moderator for tonight's debate between James W. and Praise I Am on the specific question: is biblical slavery morally good? Praise I Am would say yes, James W. would say no. Both James and Praise have had many debates in the past and are therefore experienced debaters who know this topic extremely well. What this means is this will be a debate to remember on the important and also very controversial topic of slavery. So, James and Praise, when deciding on what topic we should debate tonight, you definitely picked a good one. So, with that, Praise and James, let's have some brief intros, break the ice a little bit before we get this party started. I know a lot of people have been looking forward to this epic showdown between you two. And so, Praise, let's start with you. Good to have you. Appreciate your time, devoted to these topics. How you doing? A little bit about yourself and a little bit about your channel.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks for having me on, SFT. I'm thrilled to be here to discuss this important biblical topic. And I'm also looking forward to hopefully having what looks to be a fruitful discussion or dialogue with James tonight. But yeah, I have an apologetics channel that focuses on defending some of the criticisms that come against the Bible. And this is one of those. I mean, it should be an intriguing discussion tonight. Can't wait to hear what James has to say and bring to the table, and hopefully, I'll bring some other counters to that as well. But yeah, man, this is the best debate channel out there. I'm just glad to be here.
Praise. I appreciate the kind words. And you've had debates on this topic in the past. James has had debates on this topic in the past as well. So I think it's a lot of fun to have you guys come together and kind of duke it out in the debate octagon. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you both are going to bring to the table. James W., good to have you back as well. Always a pleasure. I think the last time you were here was for the 2-on-1 debate, you and Luca versus Kent. And that was a ton of fun. And so, again, thanks for being here. A little bit about yourself, a little bit about your channel.
Well, hi, guys. My name is James. I am an atheist, counter-apologist, and debater. I meet with my co-host, Amy Newman. We run a channel on the Amy Newman channel where we do shows 2 to 3 times a week. Generally, we do a Bible study, an atheist version of it. Everybody's invited. And we do handle theological and religious topics, pseudoscience, just a whole wide variety of interesting stuff. So you can come by, check us out. We always do open mics. And yeah, thanks, guys. Glad to be here. Donnie's always a gracious host. And it's good to finally be getting to speak with Praise.
Yes, it's been in the making for a long time. We just wanted to leave.
It's been a long time in coming.
We just wanted to leave our audience in suspense, but it is here. And so no pressure, James and Praise, but, don't disappoint. So James, thank you for the intro. Same with you, Praise. For the audience sake, if you like what you're hearing from tonight's debaters, Praise and James, please do check the description box where you can find the relevant links. They both have been here as well in the past for debates on other topics. You can find those up on the channel. And so real quick, for the audience sake, let's go over the format for tonight. So it's going to be comprehensive, as it is a massive topic. This is a topic that's been debated tirelessly, I guess one could say. So we're going to have 15 to 20-minute opening statements. That's just to give the debaters enough time to feel like they're able to make their opening arguments to set the foundation for tonight. Anybody just joining us, again, we're debating, is biblical slavery morally good? And so whatever time's not used in the opening statements, we'll just throw into the discussion portion. Then we're going to have 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttals, followed by everybody's favorite part of a debate, a 45-minute free-flowing discussion where the debaters are asking each other and discussing the topic, points brought up in the openings and rebuttals. Then we'll have a 5-minute concluding statement. Then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We're going to have a roughly 25-minute audience Q&A portion. And so please, if you have a question for the debaters, James W. or Praise, make sure to tag me at Standing for Truth or at Donny, just something where I can see. And also who the question's for. So, question for James, question for Praise, and that'll make the Q&A portion move along smoothly. So with that, introductions are out of the way, and we're going to get right into it. So Praise, you get the first 15 to 20 minutes in terms of opening statements. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Sweet. Is my screen shared, ready to go there, SFT?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. So, is biblical slavery morally good? The danger of committing presentism, the historical fallacy, and ethnocentrism. Before I jump into the main presentation, I want to caution my opponent to not fall into the dangerous faux pas academics and historians refer to as presentism and ethnocentrism. These errors are dangerous because they taint, demean, and even slander past cultures. The presentism fallacy is a historical term meaning to judge past actions by today's standards, or an uncritical adherence to present-day attitudes, especially the tendency to interpret past events in terms of modern values and concepts. Subsequently, ethnocentrism is defined as an evaluation of other cultures according to preconceptions originating in the standards and customs of one's own culture. The only way to avoid these dangerous errors is to provide scholarship and or critical historical analysis of the ancient Near East to support your viewpoints. Anything short of this is outright insolence and can be considered bigotry culturally. Now I will begin with the main presentation. Scholarship provides insight on the nature of the servitude in the A&E, ancient Near East, and it was very humanitarian and ethical, as you will see. Elite A&E scholars give consensus on slavery in the ancient Near East. This is the Oriental Institute seminar, and these were like the elite ancient Near East scholars. But here's what their general conclusion on the consensus of that seminar is: thus, one result of the Oriental Institute seminar is a consensus that scholars should dispense with the slave-free dichotomy. Perhaps if there is any meaningful dichotomy to society, it involves household affiliation versus no household affiliation. While many non-slave persons could lack a household attachment, slaves are one social group that was always and by definition attached to a household or institution. By those means, slaves are one group that was guaranteed social status that was not completely or necessarily at the bottom of the society. At one time, the relationship between slave and state was cast of one of oppression, labor exploitation, or management of foreign captives. This was the prominent viewpoint that James is espousing tonight. But even as early as in the 1950s, ancient states were built on the backs of slave labor. Sorry, I lost my position there. Or at least a few Near Eastern scholars abandoned the notion that ancient states were built on the backs of slave labor and war prisoners. Since then, perspectives of mobility in royal households, since then, perspectives have shifted even further. Studies are showing how slaves enjoyed mobility in royal households, transcending social boundaries to achieve higher statuses. And this is by this is the group of people, but you can check it out by B 2004, Laura Culbertson, Slaves and Households in the Ancient Near East. The A&E is characterized as communal debt slavery by PhDs Ella Karev and Seth Richardson. That's what they say. There were no slave markets and no households with hundreds of laborers. Rather, slaves were bought and sold on an ad hoc basis, traded between individuals who oftentimes knew each other before the sale. Slaves worked as all people did, but the nature of the work they did was not discernibly different from that of other individuals, general individuals that were free citizens, and did not provide much surplus income to their owner. Female slaves were often domestics, raising children and taking care of households. In essence, doing little different from what a housewife or a homemaker might do. An enslaved person could be sent to the household of a creditor for forestall default of an existing loan or as a collateral against a new one while goods were moved through the marketplace to point out the sale. No matter what household they resided in, they maintained economic value through their labor, but there is little indication that this produced significant profit. Slaves were primarily for credit, not for labor. So Mosaic debt slavery is far better than historical indentured servitude. We're going to get into the differences. So Oxford Bibliographies.com documents historical indentured servants that were children served longer tenures than adults did. However, the Bible documents children did not have longer tenures than adults. Leviticus 25:41. Historical indentured service did not inherit the employer's house and goods. However, Genesis 15:2-3 records Abraham bequeathing his assets to a foreign female Aved. This was referred to as adoption by manumission by A&E historians and scholars. I mean, here's a citation: Raymond Westbrook, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law; Junius Rodriguez, The Historical Encyclopedia of World Slavery. Historical indentured servants did not have safeguards that were put in place to protect financial exploitation, like Mosaic servants had in place, Exodus 22:25-27. Employers of historical indentured servants didn't have extra food for their servants like Israelite masters left for their servants, Leviticus 19:9-10. And here's a fifth, and I think a critical one here, is employers of historical indentured servants never canceled all debt of all people in a specific year as the masters of Mosaic servitude did, Leviticus 25:8-22. So we'll get to some quotes here by scholars. So freedom in the ancient Near East was a relative, not an absolute state, as the ambiguity of the term for slave in all the region's languages illustrates. Slave could be used to refer to a subordinate in the social ladder. Thus, the subject of a king were called his slaves, even though they were free citizens. The king himself, if a vassal, was a slave of the emperor. Kings, emperors, and commoners alike were slaves of the gods. Even a social inferior, when addressing a social superior, referred to himself out of politeness as your slave. There were, moreover, a plethora of servile conditions that were not regarded as slavery, such as son, daughter, wife, serf, or human pledge. And this is by Raymond Westbrook, professor of Semitic languages and professor of Near Eastern languages. Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only of servanthood. Alex Mottier, Old Testament scholar. There is nothing inherently lowly or undignified about being an Aved. Indeed, is an honorable and dignified term. This is John Goldingay, PhD, Old Testament. 3 Old Testament civil laws are quite unparalleled in any other ancient Near Eastern code. Exodus 21:20-21 and Exodus 21:26-27 take up the case of slaves injured or killed by their own masters. And Deuteronomy 23:15-16 grants asylum to a runaway slave. No other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, as distinct from the injury done to the slave of another master. And otherwise, the universal law regarding runaway slaves was that they must be sent back with severe penalties for those who fail to comply. And this is Christopher Wright, Old Testament scholar. Now we're going to go into why Mosaic servitude was not only moral, but it's the best socioeconomic system we've ever known. Israelites, point number one, Israelites and non-Israelites were under one law. I really want to stress this tonight because there is no separate law for foreigners. Therefore, the charge of the Pentateuch permitting or endorsing mistreatment of Israelites is patently asinine. especially when God commanded Israel to love and not oppress aliens. We see this in Exodus 22:21, Exodus 23:9, Deuteronomy 24:14, and Leviticus 19:34. The biblical socioeconomic system was instituted to prevent poverty of both Israelites and non-Israelites by providing debt relief. Deuteronomy 24:14, Leviticus 25:35 and 47. This cannot be chattel slavery because servitude came about through extreme poverty, not through force or coercion, which is a capital offense. Leviticus 19:34, Exodus 12:47 through 48, and Numbers 15:16 through 17 ordered Israelites to receive foreigners as one of their own. So they weren't foreigners. The word foreign, the foreigners in the ancient Near Eastern context didn't exist, because there was a mixed multitude of different ethnicities and different peoples back then. So there was no racial distinctions back then. I think that is a huge error that some people make when they try to, when they criticize the Bible. Here's another point. All Eveds maintain kinship rights. Exodus 21:3 and 9, Leviticus 25:41, 47 through 49, and lastly, verse 54. All Eveds had marriage rights, Exodus 21:4, and then also 10 through 11, providing for a daughter contract into a marriage. Eveds had personal legal rights relating to assault and protection from breach of contract, Exodus 21:8, 20, and 20 through 28. All Eveds were included during worship observance and were regarded to be as part of the nuclear family of Israel, which guaranteed basic necessities. We see this in Genesis 17:13, Exodus 12:44, Leviticus 22:11. Foreign Eveds joined with Israel during war, Genesis 14:14. Foreign Eveds inherited property from Israelite masters, Genesis 15:2 through 3. The Pentateuch provided freedom for movement of female Eveds in access to liberty, and also providing for a daughter contracted into a marriage, Exodus 21:8 and 11. If chattel slavery was such a thing in the scriptures, there would have been owners, Baals, not masters, Adons, because chattel livestock, for example, would be returned back to their owner. Example, Exodus 21, 29, and 34, while escaped Eveds were not to be returned back to their masters, as Deuteronomy 25:15 stipulates. The 10 Commandments represent loving God and your neighbor. This is why it's patently impossible for there to be slavery and for it to be immoral, because we're going to get into that right now. The 10 Commandments encapsulate the entire 613 laws of the Pentateuch. They are classified as paradigmatic law rather than exhaustive law by scholars. This is Christopher Wright, The Gospel into the Modern World, Douglas Stewart, Exodus and Exegetical and Theological Exposition. The first 4 commandments are about loving God, and the last 5 commandments are about loving your neighbor. In these commandments hanged the entire law, as Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18-34 discloses. The Decalogue outlawed any type of slavery, rape, or any other criminal act because it would fall under not loving God or your neighbor. This is David Zaslow, Reimagining Exodus, Robert Veen, Fulfillment of the Law. So those are some sources, citations for you guys to check out. So more on paradigmatic law from Douglas Stewart, or Dr. Douglas Stewart, PhD. A final implication of paradigmatic law: not all laws will be equally comprehensive in scope. That is, some will be very broad in their applicability. Love Yahweh your God. And some much more narrow, do not bear false witness, for example. One might ask, why not say don't be dishonest in any way, which would be broader and more comprehensive than don't bear false witness? But that would be missing the point, or missing the way paradigmatic law works. Through general behaviors and very general regulations of broad categories of behavior, the reader-listener comes to understand that all sorts of situations, not exactly specified either because a law is too broad or so narrow, are also implicitly covered. In other words, when all the laws are considered together, one's impression is that both the very narrow, precise issues and the very broad, general issues fall under the purview of God's covenant. The wide variability of the comprehensiveness is intended to help the person desiring to keep the covenant to say, I now see that as the tiniest detail as well as the widest and most general way I am expected to try to keep this law. It is in all its implications, not just in the terms of its exact wording. Some commandments are thus less broad in scope. In this way, they are expressed then and necessary to cover all the intended actions. Other are so broad in scope in the way that they are expressed that one could never think up all the ways they might be applied. This is just as it should be. The narrow and the broad taken together suggest the overall comprehensiveness of the covenant will for his people. So I think what he's, just to recapitulate what he's saying here, Dr. Douglas Stewart, is that when we look at the Ten Commandments, they encapsulate every single moral detail. And this is called paradigmatic law. And that's how it's constructed. It's not going to be exhaustive law like we have today in our society. Yes, biblical slavery was morally good because it prevented poverty. And it was built on loving God and your neighbor. And with that, I concede my time to James.
Praise, thank you so much. That was about 16 minutes. So you did excellent on time. Appreciate the opening statement. And that'll be roughly 4 minutes that I will throw into the open discussion portion of the debate. And let me I'll let the audience know I'm all caught up on questions. We've already got almost 10 questions just during the opening statement 1. So I knew this would be, you guys are right. This is an engaging topic. So James W., we're going to hand the floor over to you now. I'm going to reset the timer. And so whenever you're ready, James, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Donny. Thank you, Praise. So I'll just start right off by assuring Praise that I'm not going to engage in presentism. I am a moral relativist. I don't make broad, sweeping moral statements. I don't make absolute pronouncements on morality. I give my opinion and I give reasons why I have an opinion, and then we can have a discussion about it, not judging the people in the past based on the standards we have today. When I say that slavery, including debt slavery, including forms of slavery talked about in the Bible, is immoral, I'm not judging the people that engaged in it, ancient man, as evil or, as bad people. They didn't have the benefit of what we have today. What I mean is we would not want to, if it was good back then and it was morally right, then you could say we could engage in it today. And I would say, no, that would not be a good thing because our society has evolved for the better. Doesn't mean they were bad. It just means that morality is a constantly evolving facet, just like biological life. So biblical slavery, is it morally good? So I'll start off by saying I speak tonight for the dignity of man. And that's how President Johnson began his address to Congress in 1965 after the incident in Selma, Alabama, where nonviolent protesters were brutally assaulted by police. The dignity of man leads us to conclude that in all cases, reductions of human to property, to goods, chattel, is inherently problematic. There's no good or right way to go about it. But what are we doing here? Did we abolish slavery over 100 years ago? Why do we have to keep coming back to this? Well, this really should be an open book test in terms of morality. It should be easy. It is. The problem is they're reading the wrong book. They have arbitrarily chosen to believe and accept a book as absolute truth. The book written by ancient man has lots of silly things in it, and but they've already decided that it must be true. And people will say, I'm an atheist, so I'm biased against the Bible. I just want to think everything is bad in the Bible. But, well, there is a lot of bad in the Bible. Deal with it. But I'm not making the argument that absolutely everything in the Bible is bad. It's true. The Bible occasionally does say some good things or true things that, just like any ancient work, occasionally ancient man stumbled onto some truth, some little nugget of goodness that we can even recognize today. That's the nature of man. These were not dumb people necessarily. They just didn't know as much as we did, so they still have humanity in them. And but yeah, not everything in the Bible is wrong. So if God had come out and say, "Thou shalt not make property of anybody," if you make a loan to somebody, be wise. If you don't think your brother can pay back the loan, don't make the loan. And if you decide to make it anyway, be prepared to take a loss on it. But they've decided to defend it all, everything. And as praise came with lots of scholarship today, they've had 2,000 years with very smart people to try to retcon this, try to put perfume on this pig and make it sound a lot more palatable. But and I congratulate them on that. They've done the best that they can with it. And yeah, we have such precious little communication from this God that telling us created the universe. And why is it that given the chance to advance the cause of humanity, to move humanity forward, to teach us things that were beyond our capacity to understand and know, to give us wisdom beyond what we had the ability to find out, why is it that almost always the God of the Bible simply just goes with whatever ancient man would have thought about an issue? Are we talking about some type of moral entropy? They like to talk about genetic entropy, but are we talking about moral entropy where we started off with being very moral in the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and now we've devolved and we're becoming less moral today? I don't know. Maybe that's what they think. Let me pull up. I have a PowerPoint here. I'm going to pull up a few Bible verses so you guys know what I'm reading from.
I can pause your timer as you're getting those slides up.
All right, one moment.
James.
All right, share my screen.
A few people might be, I think that might have been coming from Praise's end, because some people were saying, or it could be your keyboard, James. They're just saying some
Getting some
background
feedback.
noise.
All right, I'll try to be quiet with that. Are we good?
Okay, your screen is shared.
What does the Bible actually say about slavery? Well, it starts off in Genesis 17:12, where it talks about people bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. So right off the bat in Genesis, and as Praise mentioned it, from Abraham talking about that he had slaves. So even before we get to Exodus, Leviticus, we're already starting off the bat. So this is an established thing that's been taking place in that culture for quite some time. And Exodus 21, if thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and the seventh he shall go out free. Debt slavery right here. If he came by himself, he shall go out if they give him a wife. And we all know that, how the master can trick him into becoming a slave for life by giving him a wife. Yeah. Exodus 21, the kidnapping thing. And if he stealeth the man and selleth him, he shall surely be put to death. I mean, how would you prove that? Anybody could just say, I was kidnapped as a slave. But Deuteronomy 24 comes back and specifically applies this to Israelites. If you kidnap an Israelite, it doesn't necessarily make it clear that it's talking about Hebrew. So what's the problem with having this debt slavery? What's the big deal? People have to pay debts, right? Now, Abraham Lincoln said, "Familiarize yourself with the chains of bondage, and you prepare your own lips to wear them. Accustomed to trampling the rights of others, you have lost the genius of your own independence and become fit subjects for the first cunning tyrant to rise up among you." What's he talking about there? What's he mean by that? What he's saying is, by having this system of slavery where you can enslave some people, by allowing for that, it can only be a matter of time before somebody else comes along and decides, well, actually, maybe you should be the one wearing the chains. So by having that system, you endanger everybody. Then we get to this one, which, if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money or property. In the other terms, so you beat your servant and he survives for a day or so, no harm, no foul. Well, I mean, they seem to talk about like slavery in the more modern era as if it was terrible. Let's talk about Arthur Hodge and the murder of Prosper. Arthur Hodge was a West Indies slave owner in the early 1800s. He was a particularly cruel slave owner by the standards of the day. He used to pour scalding water down the throats of his female slaves when they spoke to him in a manner that he didn't feel was giving him enough respect. Great guy. The crime. There was a slave by the name of Prosper. On October 2nd, 1807, he was picking mangoes for Arthur Hodge. He had the misfortune of dropping one of these mangoes from a tree. Arthur Hodge happened to notice this and said, "That's fine, no problem. Just buy the mango and you're good, because it's damaged now and I can't get full price for it. So you just buy the mango and we're all good." Of course, you don't pay me. I don't have money to buy the mango. Let's go be a problem. You go have to get that money or I'm going to beat you. And if he couldn't get the money, so Arthur Hodge ordered him to be beaten. He was beaten for the better half of an hour, and with the instruction that he would be beaten the next day if he could not acquire the money. He was beaten the next day for an hour. He died 14 days later. Arthur Hodge was indicted on a charge of murder on March 11th, 1811. Arthur Hodge was found guilty of murder. The jury, however, recommended mercy for Arthur Hodge. They recommended that he not be sentenced to death, but the trial judge overrode that recommendation. And as everyone still sat there, he had no hesitation in sentencing Arthur Hodge to death. He was executed for murder. Let's see, then we have Gordon, the famous picture from the Civil War, the slave who took a severe beating in Louisiana. Now, he didn't die at all, not a day or two. He just didn't die. He survived that beating. But even that beating was considered excessive in the antebellum South. That was considered by most people to be cruel. Says he said himself, "Overseer Arteucare whipped me. I was 2 months in bed sore. My master came. After I was whipped, he discharged the overseer." So he saw that his slave had been beaten that badly. He fired the overseer because he did not want his slaves to be treated that badly. But the Bible says, hey, he survived, no harm, no foul, right? He survived more than a day or two. He just didn't die at all. Martin Tabbert, he was a kid from North Dakota who was beaten to death by prison guard Thomas Walter Higginbotham, struck 150 times, 1922. He died within hours, so I guess he could have been charged via the Bible, but it did cause the governor to reform convict leasing and to prohibit corporal punishment of adult offenders in the prisons, even though it continued with children at the infamous Dozier School for Boys decades after that, unfortunately. Joseph Wall, 1802, he was a colonial administrator. He had several soldiers beaten severely. They all died. They all lasted more than a day or two after that. He had Private George Patterson, 800 lashes with a rope. Sergeant Benjamin Armstrong, 800 lashes. They all survived more than a day or so. Joseph Wall was sentenced to death too, because even they considered that to be an abomination. How to sell your kids into slavery? Exodus 21. Sell your daughters into concubinage as a way of paying off debts. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. She's going to be a concubine for life. If she pleases not her master, well, not if she's not pleased. They don't really care whether she's pleased. If the master is not pleased, well, then he can get rid of her. But she has no choice in the matter. Just imagine that. Imagine that for a second, that your children are property, are a means to pay off a debt in this society. So imagine, we've all had these family conversations around the dinner table when sometimes money gets tight. So imagine having your daughters out there and you have to think, well, I mean, how much can we get for one of these? Joshua from Citibank is coming over. Girls, we're a couple months late on the mortgage, so get yourselves dressed up all cute, and maybe he'll leave with one of you guys, and we won't have to pay back the rest of our debt. Amen. And if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, he shall let him go free for the eye's sake. If he smite his master's tooth, or he shall go free for the tooth's sake. This sounds pretty good, but all these other cases of these people being beaten to death, they didn't lose an eye, they didn't lose a tooth. Now, what they're going to say is, well, I mean, look at the spirit of the law. It means if he inflicts an injury upon them, an eye would be a severe injury. They'll say a tooth is a minor injury. I don't know what world you're in where if you get hit in your spit and teeth, that's a minor injury. But I guess compared to being killed, but by their standard, it is. We have war slavery. Women and children treated as property, plunder, spoils of war. Women having their family killed, being told to shave their head, given some time to grieve, and being compelled to marry possibly the same person who killed their family. Sometimes women and children were just killed outright along with the men. So I guess maybe they were lucky. I don't know. But we get to the New Testament. We get to Romans 13, and where Paul tells us that God is in control. Hey, God sets up the earthly powers. So if your nation makes laws from slavery, well, I mean, God instituted that government. So that's from God. Obey the laws of the land. So if God sets up chattel slavery in your country, if your government does, well, God wanted it to be that way, right? Get to Ephesians. Servants, be obedient to them, your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness to your heart, as unto Christ. Colossians 4, masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing ye have masters in heaven. Thanks, Paul, for that little bit of kindness there. That's thank you, Paul. Titus 2, exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters, please them well in all things, not answering again. It means don't talk back, otherwise you might get smacked around a little bit. Not stealing, but shewing all good fidelity, that they may not adorn doctrine of our Savior Christ in all things. Yeah, Paul, we get the idea, right? 1 Peter 2, servants, be subject to your masters with fear, not only the good and gentle, but also to the proud. That means the mean masters, the guys who are an asshole. Still obey him, don't resist. But this is thankworthy if a man bore conscience towards God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. Don't worry about it. God will make sure you get rewarded in heaven. It's all good. This life is so short. You've got better things coming in heaven. And Jesus, the Prince of Peace, save us. Well, he tells us in Luke 12, the servant which knew his Lord's will and prepared himself not, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. He gets beaten to within an inch of his life. He gets a severe beating. Verse 48, but he that knew not and did commit things worthy of stripes shall be beaten with few stripes. So even if you didn't know, well, I mean, you don't get out of a beating. You still get a beating, but you get a lighter beating. You don't get beaten to within an inch of your life. You just get a moderate beating, which, I mean, I guess, thank you. Thanks, Jesus. But yes, so I'm not saying that the Bible is wrong, is evil in everything. I'm not making the argument that the forms of slavery in the Bible are the most evil, that they're the worst incarnations of this ever. They're probably not. Be that as it may, they're still not good, and we still would not want to emulate things like that today. This concept that debt is so inviolable that it can strip someone of their human rights. I mean, to me, this almost seems like a scam, because Hebrews were not allowed to loan money to each other with interest. It was considered usury. It was illegal. So you really had no incentive. Why would you loan money to anybody else? You can't make any money off of it. It seems like the only possible incentive it could be is, well, if they can't pay back, you get to enslave them, which which seems to have happened quite a lot back then. So why are all these people loaning money to all these people who can't pay them back? You know, in the modern world, we have lenders have duties, due diligence to not make predatory loans. Lenders have responsibilities to not loan people they know can't pay the loans back. Now, of course, at the time, we hear that this is a poverty program. This is a works program. They didn't have the benefits of our modern welfare state, and that's true. And it is true that these systems of forced labor persisted throughout the world. They did. There's no denying that. But what we have today, I think, is a better system.
1 minute.
It's moving in the right direction, and slavery that we saw in the more modern era, slavery that began, say, in the Middle Ages, that incarnation of it, was done lock, stock, and barrel with the approval of the Christian church. Christians set these slave systems up, so they're looking at these slave systems that were set up, these religious-based systems of slavery, like we had in America, where you have Christians enslaving non-Christians. As the Old Testament would suggest, you treat your brothers differently than you treat the foreigners. So they're the ones who set these systems up. Now they're saying, well, you know, they're not compatible with the Bible, but they're actually a lot more compatible with the Bible than they want to admit.
Okay, James, thank you so much for that 20-minute opening statement. Gentlemen, we have concluded the 20-minute opening statements for the debate tonight. And so we're now moving into an 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttal. And so, Praise, we're going to hand it over to you. And whenever you're ready, you've got 8 minutes. Just make sure to unmute yourself, and I will begin the timer on your first word.
All right, awesome. There's a lot of ground to cover, but I'll try to do the best I can within the time I have allotted. So James mentioned that he was a moral relativist. So why? But the point is, we see morals are obligatory binding objectively. All we need to do is prove that one moral proposition is true, like torturing babies for pleasure is wrong. Then hence moral realism is true. Then hence objective morality is true. So like I think your moral paradigm is severely lacking. And I think this shows to you, I think, why your worldview is, I hate to say it, ridiculous or trash. And he also mentioned debt, slavery, immoral, but James didn't tell us why. This is why I mentioned the presentist fallacy and ethnocentrism in the beginning of my presentation, because the conditions of the millennial old cultures are not like it is today. So the socioeconomic system that was instituted by Moses, or, through the group that Moses worked with, was to prevent destitution and poverty. That's what it was there for. Like, what is so immoral about that? I don't understand James. I don't understand any atheist or critic that comes against the Bible. And he says the dignity of man. So he mentioned that point too in his opening, the dignity of man. But Aveds were high-ranking officials like Pharaoh's military leaders. Moses was an Aved. Are you going to say Moses mistreated? Like he was a leader of Israel. Like he was recognized, as probably the highest leader out there at one time. And then James mentioned, "Thou shalt not make property of anyone." But I think this is the problem we have too with some of these critics today, is they don't get into scholarship. They come from their 21st century lenses, and then they try to criticize the Bible from them. They don't actually put in the time and the effort to actually look and see what is the word property, acquisa. The word is acquisa in the Hebrew. And never does it refer to humans or individual humans. There's one time Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, but it's for, if you actually put some research into it, it means economic output. God owned all the land, so they can't be on the level of land or anything like that because God owns that. And that's explicitly mentioned in Leviticus 25. The word property, acquisa, has nothing foul about it. In fact, Ezekiel 44, 25, I think it's 40, yeah, Ezekiel 44, 26 through 28 mentions that God is the property of Israel. We will inherit him. He is the property possession of Israel. So are you going to say that since God is property, then somehow like he's a slave of his own people? And how is an unbound immaterial being then a slave of a human being? That's like a category. It's an oxymoron to claim that God is a slave of his people because he's called property. So check out Ezekiel 44:28. It actually says God is acquisa property. So we have to properly explicate and understand what's going on behind these words that are used in a 2,000, 3,000 year old text. Like it does require scholarship. And then I knew he was going to go to Exodus 21 there because that's the typical go-to. And, I think there's just so much misunderstanding, misconceptions that non-believers of the Bible and critics of the Bible come at the Bible with. So let's start. So the specific laws known as the Mishpatim are chiastic, meaning there are groups of law codes that have ideas that are presented and then are put in reverse order. For example, if not death penalty, then lex talionis, and if not lex talionis, then death penalty. We see this chiasm, it's a literary device, being played out in Exodus 21, 2 through the end of Exodus 21. So the whole chapter of Exodus 21 is chiastic. And this is brought out by scholars like, Bernard Jackson, and he's one of the top scholars in the field. And he put this in his book called Studies in the Semiotics of the Biblical Law. So this is all just a lack of scholarship. Moreover, it says life for life, bruise for a bruise, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, bruise for a bruise. So when we see the inclusion of the tooth, when we hear like the tooth, don't hit the tooth, or I think it was the nose, or I'm sorry, the eye and the tooth. But here's what Christopher Wright says in God's People in God's Land. The inclusion of the tooth indicates that the law does not intend only grievous bodily harm, but any unwarranted assault. And here's another thing that James doesn't understand, because I don't think he put research into it. The 2 or 3 days is reflecting a judicial decision that had to go through the courts, because the Aved could fraud his master, a loophole. He could make up something and say, well, my master hit me in the face, or he abused me, and he can like punch himself. I think anyone has seen the movie Liar, Liar, where, Jim Carrey was beating himself up in the bathroom. Well, this is the same thing that could play on the ancient Near East. So they needed evidence. 2 or 3 days was not because the guy was limping around or in some type of bed. Like he was, in fact, I've known people that have sprained their ankle and they've been out for months. So if you're going to be beat to an inch of your life, it's going to be longer than 2 or 3 days. But this 2 or 3 day decision was based on a deliberation of the courts to see if there was enough evidence to see if there was any guilt or malice that the master brought forth. And this is, you can read this again from scholars like Walter Kaiser, and this is Old Testament ethics. So that's what the time is for, because there's a loophole there. If you actually look at it, that the servant or a vet could make something up to get out of their contract. And then, there's some other things. Is why is James mentioning events from the 17 and 1800s? This debate pertains to what the Bible says, not what people did ignorantly or maliciously. Even if they misinterpret the Bible, their ignorance cannot be weaponized. Anyone into sexual slavery, but see, this is impossible because prostitution was outlawed in the Torah, Leviticus 19:29, and also war rape was outlawed in 1 Samuel 21:2-5. No sex in the temple, no sex during the battle. So it's impossible to have sexual slaves. A father arranged the marriage of his daughter because it's called a mohar. It's a bride gift. And these are just misunderstandings of the Bible. I'll end it there, and I'm looking forward to discussion with James. Thank you so much.
Praise, thank you so much for that 8-minute rebuttal. Lots of excellent points and topics to discuss in detail, gentlemen, for the discussion portion. But before that, we've got James W. You've got your 8-minute rebuttal. And so whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Donny and Praise. So yeah, I'm going to hit on a few things that Praise mentioned in his first presentation. So he says things like, we know today that ancient societies were not built on slave labor. Well, yeah, like we know that Egypt wasn't, because we know that the Exodus didn't happen. It was a myth. So we know that slavery wasn't used on that scale. And he points out that slaves had some rights, and they could even become chiefs, like Joseph did, I guess. But yeah, that was in the Egyptian system, according to the story. Of course, he didn't exist, but even in the Egyptian system, he was able to climb the ranks in there. And that slaves did labor similar to free persons sometimes. Yeah, hey, labor needed to be done. It was kind of the same. That manumission was possible. Abraham did it. He even allowed people his slaves to inherit property. Well, I mean, manumission's always been a thing in virtually every slave culture. There's always been ways to manumit to free your slaves. That's and some of them were allowed to inherit property or own property. It was different based on the system, but all indentured servants, at least in the modern era, according to the laws, had rights to adequate food, sustenance, housing, clothing. Even slaves had rights to those. And he talks about runaway slaves. So we've hit this before, that this is talking about slaves that were not Hebrews. This is slaves from other countries, other cultures who wandered into the land of Israel. They were not to be returned to their master. This is not talking about slaves owned by other Israelis, because, well, if that were the case, what would be the point of enslaving somebody if all they have to do is run away and you can't return them back to them? And, he talks about the 10 Commandments and love your neighbor and all these type of platitudes that we see throughout the region. Believe it or not, most people don't view themselves as, horrible people. Most people kind of like the idea of treating your neighbor well, and they like to be treated well, so they try to treat other people well. It's kind of a thing you see throughout all time in human culture. Whether or not they always followed it is something else to be discussed, but it is something that you see throughout the region. It's not at all surprising to see this in the biblical text. But what we have is when we have different rules, when we have a system that says love your neighbor, and then on the very next page it says tells you how to beat your slave. Well, you don't say, oh, well, beating your slave is not loving, so therefore this one supersedes that. No, we read them in harmony, we read them together, and we read it saying that beating your slave might not necessarily be unloving if they need it, if they did something wrong, if they need to learn a lesson. If they looked at you the wrong way or they spoke to you irreverently, maybe they just need to be smacked around a little bit. Debt slavery is immoral because it reduces people to property. It puts personhood, it puts human rights on par with debt, with a financial obligation. And this is not how we do things today. I realize that's how it was done back then. I'm not saying they were evil because it was done back then. It persisted actually much, much further than it probably should have. But we have better ways of dealing with that today. And that's all that I'm saying. We wouldn't want to go back to that. We would not want to be enslaved by the hospital if you get hurt. And we're not fortunate enough to live in Canada like Donny. But if we're in the United States and we have to go to the hospital, we would not want to be enslaved by that hospital to pay that debt. Let's see, what else did Praise talk about? So he talks a lot about the scholarship, and I intentionally take I have sort of a anti-intellectualist slant on this. I don't engage too much in what I like to term the hermeneutics hokey pokey, which is where you retcon the Bible. This language to that language, the way words were used back then, the way words are used now, yeah, we get it. Sometimes the Bible, when it's talking about slaves, sometimes it means what we would consider servant. Sometimes when it says servant, it means more like what we would consider a slave. There's a lot of nuance in the way that the words are used. That's clear. But we're looking at the big picture. I think when they focus so much on those things like that, you're not seeing the forest for the trees. What we have here is basically a form of slavery, and you're just kind of getting lost in the semantics of it. You're getting lost in the weeds, and that's what I try to avoid when I try to look at the big picture and look at why we would not want to go back to this system, why we are better off that society morally has evolved to the point where we don't use systems of slavery like this. And I will say that humans, that we in the modern, we only realized that slavery was wrong when it was no longer a economic necessity. Almost as it became less of a necessity, we were able to see the inherent cruelty and barbarism that it was. We were able to recognize it for what it was. Now, it had been in front of our faces the whole time. We just hadn't been able to see it until it was an economic necessity. But then by the time capitalism, which is actually similar to slavery in a lot of ways, Karl Marx called it wage slavery. It has a lot of the same parallels, but we'll leave that for another topic. But once capitalism began to supersede slavery and actually become more efficient, then we kind of didn't need it anymore, so we could recognize it for the evil that it always was. So Praise wanted to know why I'm bringing up things from the 1700s, why I'm bringing up things that Christians did, people labeling themselves as Christians did to slaves.
1 minute.
I'm trying to show that even the terrible things that they did to slaves were actually in some ways more lenient than what the Bible allowed, because a lot of these people beaten to death, which they were beaten to death. I don't know how you would, if you're an event, how you would trick being beaten to death and what kind of loophole you would work in, because it specifically contemplates the death of the slave. It's not talking about an injury, a slave punching them. So we're talking about a slave being beaten to death and dying 2 or 3 days later, and it being okay. That's what we're talking about. But even by the 1800s, by the 1700s, we began to realize that that was not okay. That was excessive. That was cruel. It was, in fact, murder to beat your slave and have them die 3 or 4 days later. It was murder. It was always murder, but we were able to recognize that. And I wasn't talking about prostitution. I'm talking about concubinage. That's what selling your daughter to be a concubine. Yes. So, time up.
Yes. So the rebuttals and openings as usual with these comprehensive debates, have flown by. And so, gentlemen, that completes the 20-minute opening statements and the 8-minute rebuttals. We're now moving into the discussion portion of the debate. We've got roughly 45 minutes for discussion. To the audience, I'm all caught up on questions, lots of fantastic questions already. If you want to ask the debaters a question for our Q&A portion right after the closing statements of this debate, just make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth or at Donny. And anybody just joining us, the debate title for tonight is biblical slavery morally good? So we're jumping into the discussion portion. James W. just ended with his 8-minute rebuttal, and therefore, Praise, why don't we give you the opportunity to kick us off in this discussion? Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
All right. I appreciate that, James, your rebuttal there. I'd like to get to some of those points. But I guess I want to start this off with a question, if that's all right. Is that all right, James?
That's fine.
Is homelessness, poverty better than debt slavery, and why?
Well, it's true that we have homelessness today and that persists, and that is a problem with society. And but I would definitely say that I think we do a better job today than enslaving people, even though we don't do even close to enough.
What do you mean by enslaving? Can you go into that a little bit?
Forcing people to work, making a person an article of property to be treated, bought, and sold as a article of property.
And where does this say that in the Bible?
It does say that you can, that they are your property. It makes reference to that they can be inherited, bought, and sold. Now it does go there's several different classifications of it, and it's different authors always going back. The Bible retcons itself constantly, whereas new authors would come in and say, oh, that sounds kind of bad. Let me put a kind of a softer slant on that. If you actually, everything, it's not presented in the order that it was actually written in. And these books were written hundreds of years after you think they were written anyway.
So you're referring to, I think, Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, I think, where it says that you can possess them for olam. It doesn't say forever. In the English, you could say forever, but it's sort of a anachronism because only God would be forever, or the
right.
The source
not
of
suggesting it was in the afterlife, like
okay, exactly.
Other cultures. So the word forever.
Right. So I think we know it's a limited time in some respect.
Right.
But I think but I want to get to those texts. I think we need to focus on that a little bit. Then we can go to maybe some other texts to look at. But did you read verse 47, the verse that came just right after 46?
I could pull it up. You'd have to. What are we looking at? Leviticus?
Sure. Yeah, Leviticus 25, 44 through 47 specifically. And I think that maybe we'll come to maybe a new understanding, hopefully. I'm going to try to at least present that. If you want, I can just read it too. It don't matter. I have it ready to go. Okay. So verse 47, and if a sojourner or a stranger wax rich by thee, and thy brother that dwelleth by him wax poor, and sell himself unto the stranger or sojourner by thee, or to the stock of the stranger's family. So what we see here is something that is, I think, it should be eye-opening. It's like, wow, this is glaring right off the text. And it's the fact that it says a sojourner or a stranger can wax rich. And who are those people? Well, in the Hebrew, this is why you have a little bit of Hebrew training, because, the Hebrew here is the garim, and then also the, I forget, let me get it really quick. So it's, the garim, and sorry for the the Toshavs, the Toshavim. So it's the Garim and the Toshavim. So the same people that are mentioned in 45, 46 are mentioned in 47, the Ger and the Toshavim. It says that they can wax rich. And they would be also, look at the same thing here too, that they would be in like an interchangeable type of servitude where they would send veds or, servants, whatever you want to call it, dead servants to the foreigners, and the foreigners would send servants to them. So I think it's clear, like, God would not put his people under slavery again. So it shows here in verse 47, not only are they waxing rich. Sorry, go ahead.
He did it the first time, so I mean, I don't see why he wouldn't do it again.
Yeah, well, he did say he promised that they would never go back to slavery in verses 40 in the same chapter in Leviticus 25, that in 42, Leviticus 25, 42. If you are my servants, who I brought out of the land of Egypt, they shall not be sold as slaves. And that's that's a promise. So we see in verse 47, not only the same people. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's kind of funny because a lot of times listening to these debates, a lot of times the Christians like to draw parallels today, and they'll talk about, prisoners, they are kind of enslaved in a way, which it's not a fair comparison, but whatever. But I mean, I couldn't imagine the Jewish people being carted off to labor camps and being forced to work until the point of death in the 1940s with no God coming there to rescue them, no help coming. Humans had to do that. I
mean, well, the Christians did abolish slavery. That is like a historical declaration. I mean, that's like pretty much indisputable by historians that, history. Sure. The Christians did abolish slavery.
They did it by ignoring what the Bible says. Well, ignoring the details of the Bible, because according to the Bible, slavery would endure to the end of the world, which is an argument that Southerners made in the 1800s for why we couldn't abolish slavery, because the book of Revelation says it'll endure until the end of the age.
Yeah, I kind of want to circle back around to those texts in Leviticus 25, because you said there's forced slavery there. So whenever there is what we call a lifelong commitment to a master, that is voluntary. So what I'm trying to show here is when they're buying, in verse 44, they're buying people from the nations, the Goyim. This is a voluntary thing. This isn't imposed. And I gave citations from ancient Near East scholars saying there was no such thing as forced servitude in the ancient Near East. Even a consensus. I demonstrated that in the opening of my presentation. So, I mean, you're going to have to do a lot of groundwork here to prove like these people were forced against their will, or it's involuntary somehow. That just isn't true.
Children who are born to the slave, to an enslaved woman, do not go free. They remain property of the owner, and they didn't have a choice in the matter. They were born into it. Says over and over again that the women don't go free. It says that the foreigners don't go free. It really only is explicitly clear about the male Hebrews having the option of going free, either at the Jubilee or after 6 years. They go free after the 7th.
So that is patently impossible, because Leviticus 24:22 says that they are under the same law. There is one law. So are you saying that the Jews or the Hebrews were not able to leave out of their contracts?
It's all in the same law. It clearly makes distinctions between how you treat your brethren and versus how you treat the foreigners. So it obliges you to be kind to them, but there is a distinction in how you treat. Sure, you can, in the Old Testament, you can loan money at interest to a foreigner. You can't do that to your brother. And it says specifically that not to rule over your brother with rigor. Which,
there's actually...
You can rule with rigor over people who are not your brother.
Well, there was safeguards put against that, where you couldn't there was no type of fraudulent activity or any of that type of financial exploitation. This was all. I mean, this is my opening again. Like, just check out the opening, and or it's, let's see here. I had it in Leviticus 22:11. And like, I mean, it's all over the place where you could not exploit anyone in the covenant. I mean, it's just a matter if you're what you call foreigner. And like, I want to know what you mean by foreigner. Like, what do you mean, like race or ethnicity? And what distinction is that? Like, because there is no such thing as an ethnicity difference, or as a foreigner as far as ethnicity is concerned. I'll give you plenty of citation for that from scholars.
I would think that it would be people who were not Hebrews, who were not Jews, who were not part of the covenant, circumcised males. That
so
I
you're
think
saying
is what would make the most sense.
Are you saying uncircumcised people are the foreigners?
Well, even though they did circumcise them, but people who would come from outside, who would be, not Jews. Now, if they converted or they became later, they would still come as a foreigner.
So I want to, I'm trying to, I want to nail down to the point that it says to love your foreigner, and this is in Leviticus 19:34. So how can that be construed the way that you're trying to? How could any type of slavery be relevant when it says love your neighbor? I mean, love your foreigner, in fact, or your one that's an alien to the Israeli community.
Because when we look at statutes, when we look at laws, when we look at commandments, we take it as a whole, right? And a specific commandment always outweighs the more vague, the more general, the more broad. So, as I said before, so if you have something that tells you how to beat your slave, you might consider that not to be loving, right? But it says on the next page to be loving and to care for the neighbor. Well, that wouldn't be caring, but we don't say, oh, well, the good outweighs the bad, and so therefore we don't beat the slave. No, it just means that you can beat the slave. It's not considered unloving. Maybe sometimes they need it. I think most parents who do use corporal punishment on their children would say that they're not doing it in an unloving way. That's debatable, but that's the distinction that it would be, that sometimes it's for their own good.
Yeah, let's so it says to love your foreigner as yourself. So you're saying that to beat yourself, does that mean loving to you? I mean, how many people, like, except for masochists, are you saying like the world is masochistic back then, or could you have any citation for that?
The world was brutal back then. I mean, it was, and not universally in Israel. The world was brutal. Life was considered cheap back then. People were killed. I mean, just look at the amount of capital crimes throughout the Bible. You might consider it to be unloving to execute somebody for picking up sticks on the wrong day, but God thought it was the right thing to do. So, I mean, we take it as a whole.
That is the non sequitur, because we're talking about, what the verses in the Bible we're talking about the socioeconomic system of Israel. So, like, again, it says to love your neighbor as yourself in Leviticus 19:34. Now, where in that text could you say hitting people, beating people, slaving people would be relevant? I just don't see it. I don't see how you could smuggle that in there.
It's not. It's that they didn't consider it to be a contradiction. That's why they put it in the same book. They read that and they saw no contradiction with it whatsoever. No problem. They probably viewed it as moderate correction, as because, hey, you have your debt slave, right? You have to feed them, right? You have to clothe them, house them. What can you do to them if they're not working enough? Well, the only thing you can do is to beat them, but you can't withhold the necessities of life. That was true even of slaves in America, indentured servants. You could not.
But when they have to beat themselves, because it says love your foreigner as yourself. It didn't say love a foreigner. It says love a foreigner as yourself. Now, like, let's say you take longer bubble baths. Let's say you eat more chocolate than, let's say, someone else might. Like, those things that you do extra, you go out of your way for yourself, God's expecting you to do that for them. So you have a severe misunderstanding of the moral system of the Bible.
I honestly think that has to be disingenuous argumentation on that. You really can't. Wow.
No, I would disagree. And I can prove it right now. Matthew 22:40. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
So
that's a platitude that you see all over the place. The Declaration of Independence talks about people being created equal, yet they had slaves. They didn't see it as a contradiction inherently.
The problem is that you're seeing stuff that's actually not there. And like I showed you in Leviticus 25:44 through 46, it's really in verse 47 destroys that idea. So you can't use those texts, but then you go to, talk about the children. And I think you're talking about, I wish you would cite some passages, and because it would make things easier so we could, sort of like delve into these things.
Children being sold into concubinage, or children as war plunder, children as being born from slaves.
Give me some text, maybe you can cite some verses, because how much credibility can we give you if you don't even know the verses you're talking about?
They're in my notes. This is what I didn't want to get so deep into the weeds. That's why I tried to. So you've got Leviticus 25:45. You might buy children as slaves.
Children, I don't see that.
Children must come from the families of foreigners living in your land. These child slaves will belong to you. Leviticus 25:45.
So they are the Gerim, like in the Toshavim, the same people in verse 47 where it says they can wax rich, and it says that they were doing co-business partners with Israel. And we know that God wouldn't permit or allow slavery, so we know that can't be slavery because Israel's involved. So we know that cannot be
slaves. Slavery. They could just acquire property. Certain systems allowed slaves to acquire property. Certain slaves
it doesn't say
buy
that.
Their freedom.
It doesn't say that. It says wax rich. It doesn't say acquire property. In fact, that does debunk chattel slavery.
They could become rich. They could acquire property. They could acquire status. Sure.
Well, that's exact opposite of slavery, though.
Well, it doesn't necessarily. Well, slavery may be perhaps in the context of American slavery. Sure, but slaves could buy their own freedom, and then they could become rich. It did happen where you had slaves who were able to purchase their own freedom, and then they became slave owners themselves. This is not like anything that's.
But hold on,
the Bible. Slaves achieving property. You had slaves who in Rome who were gladiators who became wealthy. It's this idea that it always has to be, no property rights whatsoever. It's just.
Well, it's not only that, but they're also in co-business partnership with Israel. So it's more than just waxing rich. But also it says that you are supposed to love them as well. As I mentioned, the same foreigner people mentioned the Gers and also the Toshavim. And 47 is mentioned in Exodus 22:21, where it says, do not oppress or restrict or defraud a foreigner. So the word there in the Hebrew is defraud. So there's just no slavery there. Like, if you have specific texts that you think actually does, let's go through them.
Well, you see, like I was saying before, it's that every text where it talks about slavery, you guys have a retcon version. You guys have an ad hoc explanation to try to make it sound like not slavery. It's almost like a no true Scotsman fallacy where You just say that, oh, that's not real slavery, that's not real slavery, that's not real slavery, because it might not check every single box that you have in your idea of what slavery should be, but it's still slavery. It just might not be, this is similar to arguments that people make for economic systems. The Soviet Union collapsed. They weren't true communists. They were more well, they were communists. They might not have checked every single box, but in most of the relevant ways that they were. So this is slavery in a lot of relevant ways. It's just some of the details might be a little.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that is so arbitrary what you're trying to enforce or try to force fit into the Bible. It just nothing. In fact, we see again, like the Bible's predicated off of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Not even just loving your neighbor, it says as yourself. Unless people were masochists, I just don't see any evidence for that either. People generally. Yeah, I mean that's what you would be saying in that text. Like if you're going to say,
how many times did God command people to destroy and slaughter entire races of people, entire cities of people? I mean, would you consider that loving? I mean, this idea that everything had to be loving is just a misnomer. It's not.
I would love to debate you on that too. I would say that's war rhetoric, and it never happened. It was just a bunch of we call propaganda. So if you get into this, Osty, some scholars get into it that this stuff actually never happened. These
I would agree with you. It didn't happen because most of these stories were made up centuries later. But the point is that they were presented as if they did happen and presented as if they were something
when I
good.
say it didn't happen, I mean actually literary. I mean, so we call this war hyperbole. If you look this up in ancient Near East, the Egyptians did the same thing. They always blew up and exaggerated what they did. And in fact, they never even happened. Like the Egyptians says they completely plundered and destroyed and ripped up all the women and all this and that of Israel, and it never happened. So the same thing was going on in the Bible as well. This is what I'm saying. You need to get into ancient Near East scholarship to get a proper understanding of Scripture.
But the point is that even though it didn't happen, it's being presented as if it did, and it's presented as if it's something good. It was something righteous. So the same book that says this is good, this is righteous, also says love your neighbor as yourself. And they didn't see a contradiction between the two.
You're misunderstanding.
No contradiction.
No, this was meant to instill fear to Israel's enemies, and they would do this propaganda. We see this even in history. The Germans did it to other people. They would say all these things that they did or what they're capable of, and they're going to trounce them. They're going to completely defeat them, and all these things. But I want to circle back to the slavery part, because I mean I'm pressing you and I don't see the evidence. I don't see the scriptural merit for your accusations of the Bible, your charges of slavery.
Are you saying there would be no case in the Bible where somebody would be property for life?
Well, I would say no. This is I'm going to get to. It would be voluntarily. This is in Exodus 21. If you read it in verse 6 through 7, that they would go to the courts and get their ear pierced, like through an awl,
right.
And then they would be committed for their master for life. And this was voluntary, though. So yes,
so
there were.
Well, you play that voluntary that's quite a tricky term. So. When you have a choice of abandoning your family or becoming a slave for life, I don't really think that's voluntary. That seems to be the product of extreme coercion and manipulation, and I don't see how that could be considered voluntary.
Well, no, again, you have a misunderstanding of the text. Again, I'm going to try to explain this to you.
It doesn't mean what it says, right?
Well, no, yeah, I think you're misreading the text. I'm going to try to help you out here. I'm not even trying to be rude.
Praise, help me. No.
All right, so the master would provide a husband or a wife to the servant, and that is provisional. You see, and it would take the master's costs in goods and time to do that. He would have to account for that. So he just doesn't give things free away, and free service and things to the
Right.
event,
Love
like
your
a
neighbor,
wife
nothing
or a
free.
husband. So he had to account for that. So that's why they didn't come out like as the normal servant does, because he provided them a mate. And also the housing for the child that would be probably, be born out of that union, like the master would have to account for those costs. So you just don't know what's going on here. You got to do some research, my friend.
Well, I understand that. This goes back to what I was saying before, that this just sounds like a scam, because this sounds like, because again, like these wealthy lenders, they have nothing to gain by lending money to all these people. So they can't charge interest. So why are they making all these loans to people? It almost seems like they would want people to default. It would be encouraged to engage in predatory lending, loan sharking, loaning money to people can't pay back, because hey, you can just enslave them. Puts everything on the borrower, puts nothing on the lender. Whereas lenders have a fiduciary duty to not make loans inappropriately, to not prey on lower income people who can't pay these loans back. That doesn't seem to be accounted for at all in the Bible. It's just this ironclad rule that debt must be paid. Debt is like the idea that a debt could not be paid, that some rich guy just might not get some of his money back, is like the end of the world. Maybe you just shouldn't be loaning everybody money irresponsibly.
Well, no, there was actually safeguards put in place where you cannot financially exploit your neighbor or anyone, that even a foreigner. So
We have
like,
those kind of rules
into
today,
that.
but it still happens. What
But that's
what
what
is always written in law de jure is not always de facto. Like we saw even in our incarnations of slavery, that slaves in all systems, they had rights and protections. It's just the enforcement of those was not very good. It was spotty at best. And you had a lot of slaves who were deprived of rights they had by law, but they were not able to enforce that because of their status as slaves and the inherent
right. But what
coercion of
people
being
do.
owned, being property.
Right, but I think you're missing the point. The Bible outlaws that, though. Whether what people do, whether they violate that, is a whole nother thing. Like, do you see how that's a shift of blame? You're blaming God that's for what people do in their ignorance and evils, and rather than what the text actually is conveying. And yes, there were
Yeah,
safeguards of financial exploitation. So no, that's just patently false.
but God doesn't get a pass on that, because humans do things like that. Humans don't know the ramifications of what they're doing. Humans don't have perfect knowledge, perfect foresight. God does, and he could have done better than this system of debt slavery. He could have come up with something a lot better. He could have advanced the cause of humanity. He could have lifted his people up so that we could look back and look at those ancient Israelites. Look at how advanced they were compared to everybody else. They must have had just knowledge that is far and away beyond what anybody else had, but unfortunately, it just doesn't seem that way. I mean, maybe they were better in a few areas. Maybe
Yeah, well,
they were a little bit more progressive, but overall, it's very similar to what all the other nations were doing. It's no great difference.
well, maybe God can just give people gold bricks and big houses back then with infinite food and infinite water and infinite sex and pleasures, all and more. Maybe God can do that.
Well,
Would that make everything more moral to you?
well, that would be a nice start, Praise. I'll tell you that would be a nice start. But you know what? You guys like to give God a pass. All this bad stuff happens according to His plan, and He just gets a pass. Like He doesn't know it. He knows exactly what He's doing. He knows the ramifications of it, and He could have done better. Praise. If He was real, He could have given us a better system. He could have given us something that would endure through the ages.
Really, without him interfering in reality? Are you saying that God can do this without interfering and imposing on reality?
Well, He imposes in reality when it suits His purposes, but
Well,
I mean,
judgment, yes.
I mean, not necessarily just that. He intruded upon Pharaoh's free will numerous times to prolong the slavery of his people, by the way. We're told in the New Testament that he is going to make people believe a lie so that he can punish them for believing the lie that he made them believe. So he's not averse to interfering with free will when it suits his
Have you,
needs. But what I was talking about
hold
is
on,
he could
hold
have.
on. Okay, but hold on. I'm going to
Go
just
ahead,
hold
go
you.
ahead, please.
I want to hold your feet to
Go
the
ahead.
fire. This one, okay. 1 Samuel
Hold them.
6:6. Have you read that text?
I don't know it offhand. It's been a while since I was deep into First Samuel.
So here's what it says: Wherefore then do not harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaohs hardened their hearts when they had wrought wonderfully among them, and they not people go and they departed. So it's really, I mean, it's not God hardening people. Yes, he did, but it was in a consequence after Pharaoh hardened his heart first. So God's a reactionist. He's being reactionary there. He's not imposing on anything as far as, like consequentially, yes.
But okay, if the Pharaoh wasn't going to let them go no matter what, why would God have to come in and harden his heart if he wasn't going to let him go either way? He wouldn't have to. The only reason God would have to step in and harden his heart is if the Pharaoh could have been open to letting him go. Maybe he could have been persuaded. Maybe he would have listened. But God stepped in and made sure that that didn't happen because he wanted to prolong the slavery of his people in Egypt. And this slavery thing, it really, you can't discuss it without talking about Egypt and how he got his people enslaved and
Well, hold on, but
just so
let
he
me
could
just respond to
rescue
that
them.
point really quick. So, yes, he did harden Pharaoh's heart for a simple reason, to show that he is the Lord above all other gods, because they had all these other gods they believed in. He had to show, because of their sinful state, that God will use it to his advantage for his own glory. And that's the God we serve. He'll use the depravity of people, like even the cross. The cross itself happened over the depravity of even Jews. The Jews are the ones that want to crucify him. So they had a hardened heart, and God used their hardened heart for a good purpose, which is to bring salvation to all people. So I
Glory
think
for himself.
might not understand the God of the Bible yet. And that's a good thing, James, because I do think that maybe down the road you can become saved. And I think this is ignorance and misunderstandings and things like that you have right now. But that's my hope for you. You really do come to the Lord someday.
I hope, praise, that one day we can walk you down and you can embrace reason and you can join us as atheists on the Amy Newman channel. We'd love to have you over there. I'm not thinking it's going to
I
happen
love
anytime
you,
soon, but I know you do, praise.
yes. She's
And
she's very nice.
she certainly is. She's a great person, but you know, regardless of the specific nuances and the hermeneutics hokey pokey, this retconning of it to try to make it sound more palatable. Um, he could have done better for us than this system that he did in the Bible. And part of the reason it's so hard to suss out is because it's just these patchwork of verses that are staggered throughout different books because it wasn't written by one author. It was written by multiple authors over. It was redacted and edited and copied and translated over and over again. So we get this hodgepodge of verses all over the place that it's kind of hard to keep track of. As you see, they're all over the place, and maybe one is in a different context than the other. Be that
Yeah,
as
I
it
just think,
may,
but a lot of these objections have been answered by theologians, scholars. I think that you're just, for some reason, I don't know why, James, why you are appealing to like liberal scholarship, because like there's other scholarship out there just besides liberal scholarship, because you're just, to me, parroting the same points what they do, which to me, conservative scholars really have addressed and overturned. I kind of, but maybe we should kind of go back to the topic too, because I think we might be veering off there a little
go
bit.
ahead.
So a foreigner, like, I don't think you substantiated what a foreigner is, because in Exodus 12, it says that when a foreigner proselytizes into the covenant, they are to be received as one of Israel's own. Like they were to be viewed.
So they're not part of Israel.
As Israel, like as their own people, in fact. So I'm still
if
trying
they
to
converted
find out.
if they converted, right?
Yes, it means they would have to get circumcision of the heart, meaning to worship the Lord. And to worship the Lord is to love your neighbor and to love God. And this is what I think the whole Bible is. The whole main principle of the Bible is the commandments, and that is to love God with your heart. All the laws and prophets, 613 laws, they all encompass and encapsulate loving God with all your heart and your neighbor. And with those two principles, how could this world go wrong? And so if you can't love your neighbor by enslaving him, you can't love your neighbor like punching him in the face, stabbing him, murdering. I mean, that was even outlawed in the first commandment. You shall not murder. So if you don't murder your neighbor, you're loving your neighbor and you're loving God. When you do that, you respect their boundaries. And I mean, we can just go through all the
same book that
commandments.
says these things. Like I said before, the same book that says all these platitudes in it also talks about massacring people. And I know you say it didn't happen, and it didn't. You're right. But it's presenting it as if it did, and it's presenting it as something positive. So, I mean, I don't think you can just sweep all these problematic issues under the rug, these verses that seem unkind on the basis of, well, it does say to be kind.
Well, I will give you that on face value. It might look pretty horrific or something like that, but that's just ignorance, though. Ignorance just means a deprivation or privation of knowledge. Once you get that knowledge, it's resolved. So I hope you're not trying to like endorse ignorance, because it seems to be a huge part of this right now. What you're steeped in is a lot of ignorance. Hopefully we don't do that. We want to get out of ignorance into knowledge and understanding.
Well, sure. I think that's the goal on both sides. I'm certainly not. When I look at this issue, like I said before, I'm not coming at this as everything in the Bible is wrong or evil or bad. It's not. Occasionally, there are really good things in the Bible. It's not that everything's wrong. It's a mixture, and I'm trying to be as reasonable about it as possible. This seems to be one of those things that's wrong. This system that puts debts above people's human rights. It reduces people to property, regardless of whether it was widespread at the time or not. It's still not something we would recognize today. We recognize today humanity as having innate rights over property rights. If you are that destitute that the only thing you have left to sell is your humanity, then you have nothing left to sell, because we won't take that from you.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because Abraham, like, are you saying that, so Abraham had a house of foreign eveds or foreign slaves, and he actually bequeathed his housing and all belongings and everything, all his horses, sheep, all his oxen and everything to those foreign eveds. So what is wrong about that? I just don't get it.
So I mean, the story had a happy ending, but that still doesn't mean that this is a good system. It doesn't mean that the people were evil who conceived it. Of course, I would say Abraham never existed. I think most of the scholarship I read would affirm that. But either way, even if he did, I wouldn't say he would be evil. Maybe he was progressive for the time. It's still the principle, this system that reduces humans to property, that subjugates humanity.
Well, let's look at the word
property
so,
rights.
yeah, so the word property in the Hebrew is akwazah. Ezekiel 44:28 calls God property. So, like, for you to make that word foul in some sense, you would need to, demonstrate that contextually and prove that. I don't see it. In fact, this is what scholars are saying. It's more in a financial sense, like moving stocks to like, or trading a player to another team, like a owner moving a contract of an NBA player to another team. That's how it was viewed.
Well,
So
this is all
acquisite does not have
financial.
anything.
Money
Yeah,
makes the world go
it's
round.
financial.
This is all financial. But when I use the word property, I'm not necessarily referring to the specific Hebrew translation. I'm using property as we would use the term. Uh,
In
this is
modern
somebody that
sense.
can be owned, bought, and sold as property, just like you would do with a car or a house. It's a possession that you can buy and sell, that you retain property rights over, which it's pretty clear as a slave was.
You
When you
right.
when you injure a slave, you pay the master because that's going to take away from the work he's able to get out of that slave, right? This is all financial transactions, no doubt about that, but it's still property.
Well, like, I disagree with that for several reasons. I'm going to give text to support this. So firstly, all humans, this is a universal, indisputed concept, the imago Dei. Doesn't matter if you're foreigner, female, male, child, they're all imago Dei, so we're all equal. But, Job speaks, I think I'm going to read Job really quick, Job 31:13-15, to try to maybe, hopefully reason with you a little bit, to maybe rethink some of these things or the biases, prejudices you have against the Bible. So here's what it says. If I have despised the claim of if my male or female slaves when they filled a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises? And when he calls me to account, what will I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him, and the same one fashion us in the womb? So, no, we're all going to be held accountable because we're all equal. This is what God's telling us in the Imago Dei, the image of God. We're image bearers of God. So there's not going to be any malice or maltreatment or mistreatment or slavery or oppressing, because then you're oppressing one of God's image bearers, made in the image of God. So no, there's just no way you can get that in there, man. I'm sorry. I just think you have these biases or prejudices. Hopefully you look in more of this stuff, and that will hopefully dissolve over time, or time goes. Yeah.
Well, like this is like the similar platitude of yeah, treat other people nice. Most people don't think of themselves as being a dick. Most people think of them like to be nice, but you have to contend with the fact that you're talking about a book that contemplates someone being beaten to death, living more than a day or two, and it being
Yeah,
okay.
and I addressed that. That has nothing to do. That has to do with the court system, deliberation. If the VED, what they would do would take time to get evidence to see if their claim was warranted or unwarranted,
Well,
because there's a
it certainly
loophole there.
doesn't explain that out in the text. And we're talking about being beaten to death, not because it's contemplating specifically the master doing the beating. This doesn't seem like it would be a judicial function. It seems like you did something wrong and you're going to get a beating, just like Jesus said. If you don't do the will of your master and you
Well,
know
let
it,
me
you get a
respond
severe
before
beating.
we end here. So this is one of the things I really did, because Jesus said the stripes, but this is called chastisement. This isn't a physical sense, because Hebrews 12:6 says that God loves and corrects the people who he disciplines and
Right.
corrects the people who he loves. This isn't a spiritual sense. This is not a physical sense.
Well, it's an
So
analogy, but it could apply either way. I mean, God doesn't interact with the physical world anymore in a
Jesus isn't
manifest
literally
way.
whipping people. Like, where does that, like, wait?
Well,
I mean, come on,
didn't he
really?
take a rod or a flail at the temple and throw the moneylenders out?
Well, he hit the table. I don't know if he hit people with it,
Well,
maybe, but
it seemed
I
like
mean,
he
like,
was. Well, it would never would have happened because there was a garrison of soldiers there specifically to make sure that something like that didn't happen. But according to the story, he seemed kind of pissed off at the time, so I wouldn't have put it past him to have hit somebody. But
no, he's gonna chastise us. Stripes means like in a moral sense. He's gonna put us into shape morally and correct us. That's what God does. He's a father to us, and So would your father beat you? And I mean, the bad fathers would, bad parents, but God is a God of love. First John 4:8.
Well,
God is a God of love. First John 4:8.
I believe it's the book of Proverbs says, if you beat your child, they will not die. Unfortunately, every year there are people beaten to death by their parents who find out just how wrong the Bible was when it said that, because they do actually die. Notwithstanding, the book of Proverbs says they won't, they do actually die. Anyway.
Yeah,
Praise, before you continue, I just wanted to let you gentlemen know that the discussion really has flown by. We got 1 minute left. And so if you wanted to make one final point, maybe, Praise, I know you were going to say something, and then we'll kind of start winding it down. We do still have 5 minute closing statements, and so we'll be able to wrap up our thoughts and points. Praise, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just some quick at the rod thing, at the beating your children. A lot of people, again, and this is the problem with people that are ignorant or stupid or have a faulty understanding of the text, is they'll take it literally when the Bible never meant it that way. If you look at other texts in Proverbs, it'll show you that text there is not in a literal sense. It's metaphorical. It means to chastise your children. It means doesn't mean actually beat them with something. Maybe you can spank their butt, something like that. I mean, that's what it means. Like, that's what it means with the rod. That's what Jesus, I'll give you an example really quick. So it says in Psalms that Psalms 2, Jesus is coming with a rod of iron. Is he really coming with a rod of iron in his hand? No, he's coming to chastise his enemies and put them under subjection that overrun this world. So we know that's not in a literal context, but
Okay, let's give James, since Praise started the discussion, James, let's give you the final word for the discussion. Then we're going to jump into 5 minute closing statements. Before you do have your last word, James, I do want to thank you both for keeping the discussion very professional and easy to moderate. So, James, go ahead. Feel free to have the final word for the discussion.
Right. Well, I mean, we run into this a lot where people didn't mean it literally. If it sounds bad, it wasn't literal. I mean, this practice was common throughout the time. And no, the Bible's not radically different from what other cultures did. That was standard by the book parenting back then. If your child, does anything that they need discipline, the harsh discipline ruled the day back then. And I mean, I really think that it's kind of naive to think that a book that commands the death penalty for insubordinate children would be averse to them receiving a harsh beating that doesn't kill them. I don't think that's a stretch to say that the Bible contemplates corporal punishment, even severe corporal punishment short of death, if it's authorizing you to impose the death penalty for it. Be that as it may, this, of course, Israel never existed under these laws, and that it never actually happened. There are no records of children being stoned to death for disobedience. Thankfully, it probably never happened, because the story that we're presented in the Torah is myth, thankfully, but it certainly doesn't present itself that way. It's trying to forge a history that never happened. We know that today, but people had to learn that the hard way. They used to think it was all real, and we have consequences as a result of that. Thank you.
Okay, James and Praise. That concludes the open discussion. Again, appreciate you both keeping it professional and also very thorough, because we had a good discussion on all of the major points and topics for the debate. So, Praise, we're going to give you the first 5 minute concluding statement. And so whenever you're ready, let me just restart the timer. The floor is yours for a closing statement.
All right, SFT, great show again tonight. I really enjoyed the discussion. This is by far the best debate channel out there. I'm just glad to be part of it. I'm blessed. And I mean, as far as the discussion tonight, I think people have seen that James did not hold up to scrutiny of the Bible being immoral in any fashion, form, or way. And there's several reasons, because, when I pushed him and to demonstrate it contextually that there was something wrong when he was claiming, there was nothing there. Like, it just dissolved away. Every time that I would press him to give some type of contextual reasoning behind it, there was nothing. And I pretty much refuted all his positions. And I'm not trying to boast, because I'm not saying I'm special or anything. But I mean, this is so easily to debunk, because all you have to do is get a little bit of scholarship, a little bit of hermeneutics. And this is what I think James was missing, is the science of interpretation. This is why God gave, people out there like scholars, apostles, evangelists, pastors, because, his Bible, his word, you're going to have to get and put some work into it, research. And I think this is what's lacking by most of the critics, we call atheists or whatever, non-believers, is they don't usually do that. And like, there's some type of prejudice or bias there. And when you like press them deeper and to, present their points, they completely crumble. And I really like James. I think that he has a lot of potential, and I think he's smart, and he's, is a game opponent for Christianity. But he is severely off tonight. Like, every time I would press him, and he would falter and crumble. And I provided scholarship tonight. I gave all citations. I gave an exegetical breakdowns. And I think the best way we can the best way to look at God is through his commandments. And this is why I gave citation for this also, that the Bible encapsulates the whole moral law is encapsulated in two principles: to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. And to do that, when you do that, you are fulfilling the law. So it's impossible for slavery to be true, because it would not be loving God or your neighbor, because they're in the imago Dei, the image of God. God doesn't like any injustice of his creatures. God doesn't like, and he will hold people accountable. This is what Job said. And this is why I quoted Job. In Exodus 22, Leviticus 19:34, to love your foreigner, not to oppress him. They're under one law. There isn't one distinct laws for foreigners that, that Israel adhere to. There's absolutely no proof of that historically. I just wish, this is my hope anyway, that, through little scholarship and research, that maybe they'll have a different view of God. Because once you have a different view of the Lord in the Bible, then you come into a relationship with him, and life gets a lot better. You have hope in life. Your life is fulfilled. You have an afterlife. And I appreciate James, coming here and having a discussion with me. And then with that, I end my time. Thank you so much, SFT. God bless.
God bless. Praise. Thank you so much for that closing statement. And James, we're going to hand it over to you. Whenever you're ready, you also have up to 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me be clear. Slavery is wrong, first and foremost, primarily because it impinges upon the dignity of man. It reduces human beings to property. However you want to define the term, whatever kind of nuance or spin you want to put on that term to try to make it sound not as bad as it sounds. But be that as it may, it's still reducing humans on the par of property, reducing us to pure economic output. We are viewed as not humans, not as individuals, but as what we can produce to a wealthy person that maybe we're in debt to, or maybe we lost a war, so we have to be slaves forever, because that's better than being killed, which is, one aspect of the slavery we really didn't get to go into. Debt slavery is wrong. We don't do it today. We don't need it. We have better ways of doing it. We have not had debtors' prisons for quite a long time, over 100 years, I believe. And you know what? The sun still rises in the morning. Everything goes on. We don't need it today. We didn't need it. It's just we didn't know, because ancient man only had the knowledge that ancient man had. There was no all-wise, all-powerful God beaming morality down to people. Ancient man had to stumble around in the dark and figure this out on their own. That's the story of humanity. It's a long, bloody crawl that we have been engaging on, and it continues today. Don't think that in any way that we're done. Don't think that we're perfect today, that there's no injustice or imperfections in our society. I'm sure the way we look back at things that happened 100 years ago and see things that they didn't see, I'm sure there's people will do the same for us, because it's an evolving process. It keeps going on. Not saying the people in the Bible were evil or terrible people, because this is the system that they lived under, and they probably had no way of knowing any better, but we do know better today. And even with that knowledge, they've had 2,000 years basically to try to make this sound more palatable, to try to have really smart people look at try to massage these texts and make them sound not quite as bad as they are, but like you're missing the forest for the trees. You're getting so into the weeds that you're not missing the big picture, which that big picture is the subjugation of human beings to property. That's the first and really the last. That is the fundamental error that this whole thing it begins with and ends with: subjugation of human beings to property. It's wrong, and we don't do it today. We should not do it today. We wouldn't want to do it today, and that's it's immoral in the sense that we would not want to do it today, not necessarily that they were all evil back then, even though some of them may have been. If you're willing to just arbitrarily assume everything in the Bible is good and true, and you can make it fit, you can make it good somehow, some way, whatever it is, it must be good. So you could just figure out a way to make that happen. Fine. I'm not looking at it as all bad. I'm looking at it as, well, there's some good, some bad. And I'm saying that this is not one of the highlights of the Bible. This is one of the darker parts of human history that thankfully we're working our way out of. And again, he mentioned these commandments, these platitudes, these loving your neighbor. But again, this is a book that glorifies massacring your neighbor, which is not loving your neighbor, but it's in the same book. So, and these people did not see a conflict with that. They did not see there being a problem with that. So obviously, it was not absolute. It was not always love your neighbor no matter what. Obviously, it was, well, I mean, you love your neighbor, but if God tells you to kill them all, then you kill them all. Even if that doesn't sound loving, it is what it is. There's no absolutes. There's no, love your neighbor. It's a good thing to live by. It's something that we all could use and do good to remember. Thank you, guys.
James, thank you for that 5-minute concluding statement. Gentlemen, that concludes the opening statements, rebuttals, discussion portion, and concluding statements. And we still got our awesome audience question and answer period to go. As always, a really solid amount of fantastic questions here. Let me give our awesome debaters for tonight a quick 30-second well-deserved break and remind the audience that last night I just set another 7 events. They are all up on the channel page. And so if you go to upcoming live streams, you should see them. And so if you're not yet subscribed and you love debates on all sorts of topics, make sure to hit that subscribe button and also share around this content, guys, because critical thinking is important. And that is precisely why we host so many important debates. So here's a couple. Again, there are a ton set for January and then next month as well. So I'm just going to go over a couple of the highlights. It's just a snapshot. So we've got both of these pastors joining me first thing next month. Pastor Matt First, Pastor Anthony Aquino, dispensationalism debate, and a fun topic but a controversial one. Who are God's true chosen people? So I'm pumped for that one. We've also got Nick Sayers and Caleb Percher here. They're going to be debating first thing next month as well. I'm basically booking now for late February and then also March. January's pretty packed right now. There might be a couple more slots to squeeze things in, but if you're interested in debates, you want to jump into the debate octagon, shoot me an email, standing for truth ministries at gmail.com, and just provide me a few details about yourself, and then also, between 3 and 5 preferred debate topics, and then that'll help me be able to set you up with the proper interlocutor. So I'm pumped for this one. Is the KJV reading of 1 John 5:7 correct? Another, of course, controversial topic. Charles Jennings will be here the end of next month debating Dan Chapa, specifically on the warning passages of Hebrews. And last thing I will say is tomorrow we're going to be back here 6 o'clock. This is going to be live. So it's a live 2-hour audience Q&A. So whether you're a skeptic or a non-skeptic, we'd love to have you here. Dr. Grady is just going to be taking questions for 2 hours pertaining to age of the earth, creation, evolution, and so on, the Bible. So if you have a question, tag me. You can even send it in over email. Let's say tonight. I'll save them and we'll have a solid 2 hours. So James and Praise, break time is over, and I am going to get us right into these questions. As usual, we could probably do questions until same time tomorrow. And so I am going to start the timer now. Let's say between 25 and 30 minutes, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. And so let's start right at the beginning. And James, it looks like the debate has turned into a 2-on-1, you and your cat versus Praise.
He's always watching, under his watch.
Always watch. Now, is your cat on your side or Praise's side?
Well, he produces for our channel, so I think he's going to be on my side.
He's on the fence.
Yeah. If he wants his cat treats, he's just going to have to.
He's going to have. He's forced to support you. Understandable. Okay, here we go. First question comes in from Anthony 1701. Question for James. If slave masters in early America believed the Bible supported them morally, why did they give slaves a Bible that was heavily edited to support slavery?
Right. Look, if you can read the Bible, if you have an anti-slavery, if you're an abolitionist, you can read the Bible and you can conjure that out of the Bible. If you're pro-slavery, you can read the Bible and find ample verses to support that. You could almost have a civil war with both sides holding up the Bible and saying the Bible supports their position on it. So in that case, the fault would be be with the one who wrote the Bible, because he could have communicated clearly if he thought that slavery was wrong, or that because he knew slavery in America would happen. If he wanted to make it clear that was wrong, he could have done that. He chose not to. We had to figure that out on our own. Yeah.
Thank you, James. Praise, anything you'd like to add?
No, not really. I think it shows you that they had to edit it. So if they had to edit it, then, so they had to change what the original Bible meant. So yeah, it shows you the Bible does never promoted slavery. And it's a modern type of movement by non-believers. And I think it's pretty much dissolving away. Hopefully it is. I think it is. I love, Dr. Josh Bowen, but I think there's some type of movement going on with him, but I think that's even starting to erode away. But I encourage people to look into scholarship. That's all.
Praise, appreciate it. James, you get the last word. Question was for you. Go ahead.
It's funny then how all these Christian nations for all these years engaged in slavery, reading the Bible, none of them ever really saw a conflict with it. They engaged in it for quite a long time, and the institution endured until about in this country 150 years ago, 160 years ago. So if it was against slavery, they didn't figure that out for a long time, huh?
Okay, appreciate it. All right, next question comes in from Creationist Crybaby. A debate on a topic like this is never complete until we've gotten a question from CC here, so I appreciate it. And CC's coming at you, Praise. CC asks, Praise, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. How do you explain the selling of children?
So I'm glad this is actually a good question because we can kind of go into this. So we look at these texts in Exodus, we have to understand that there was always some type of there was something beforehand that the master would have to provide, and so the reason why they didn't go out as normal service is because they were what we call a mohar. It's a bride price, and it wasn't for like some type of sale price, like some type of sexual slavery price. When this was a bride price. So this is why little scholarship helps. It's called a mohar. And so basically, when parents deem their child to be approaching marriageable age, the father of the groom would contact the parents of the potential spouse and negotiate the terms of the marriage, specifically the nature and the size of the mohar marriage present. So that's what it means. It means like it's something unique and special as far as like how the marriage flows. So that's what it's talking about.
Thank you, Praise. James or the cat, if you had anything to add, go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's just bad. I don't know why it's so hard to just say, yeah, selling your daughter as a slave is bad, regardless of the fact that daughters were looked at as articles of property back then. That's true. That's how they looked at it. Fathers wanted to know how much they could get for it because, hey, you've got kids. I know Praise has kids. They cost money. You put money into them, and back then they were thinking, what can we get out of them? And yeah, it's bad. And I'm glad we don't do that anymore, even though it was widespread back then. It was just how people looked at it. It was how things worked back then, and I'm glad that we have evolved away from that. Even in Christian societies, they don't engage in that practice anymore, and that's good. Daughters are human beings. They have their own abilities, dreams, and hopes. And we realize that today they're not limited to being a concubine for a wealthy person just so their father can get a fat check out of them. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, James. Praise, question was for you. You get the last word.
I just literally said this has nothing to do with servitude. I mean, this has to do with a marriage price. It's a marriage gift. It's part of the culture. They do it all the time. They do it today. Cultures do it today. Why doesn't James say, "Hey, don't do that for your children"? I mean, come on, James. This has nothing to do with slavery. It's called a mohar. Look it up. All right, I'm just going to end there.
To be clear, if something like that is happening today, I would be against it.
All right, gentlemen, moving on. Alyosha, appreciate the support. $10. Thank you so much. And I think this is directed at you, Praise. And so if you have any thoughts, it's more so just a comment. A couple of these have come in from Alyosha, so we'll put a couple on screen for you gentlemen to address. And Alyosha says, you're confusing indentured servitude with chattel slavery. Any thoughts on that, Praise?
I appreciate Alyosha for that $10. That's awesome, but I think it's sort of like assuming like the answer before even like he or she put out there. I do know the difference between chattel slavery, and I gave the distinctions tonight between indentured servitude and chattel slavery, and one of them is like you're treated they slave the person rather than the labor or the wages or the contract. So these were all these. The Israeli or the Mosaic covenant was predicated on contracts and treaties, and that would just immediately dispel any type of chattel slavery. It's just not relevant in the Israeli covenant or Mosaic covenant. But outside Israel, sure, yeah, it was in the Oriental part, it was into also in Egypt. So we do know chattel slavery did exist, but it definitely was in Israel. So appreciate that super chat though.
Thank you. Praise. James, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and this is where we kind of get lost in the. So sometimes when the Bible says slave, it means what we would consider servant. Sometimes when it says servant, it means what we would consider a slave. There's a discontinuity there. So when they set up slavery in the more modern era, when the dichotomy was that a slave was permanent and the non-slave were indentured servants that was not permanent, with the distinction being religion. It was a religious-based system of slavery.
James, appreciate it. Praise, you get the last word. Question was directed at you.
Yeah, I just think it's just a bunch of ignorance. Like, I don't know what else to say. Like, you can't. Like, why are we? To me, this borders on ethnocentrism and presentism. When you look down on someone else's culture because what they did back then, and because they did things like aveds and things like that, servitude, like indentured servitude, you have no right to look down upon that. That is atrocious thinking, and it's very harmful and dangerous. So I urge people to not follow in that type of thinking. It's poisonous, and thank you so much.
Thank you. And echoing erudite. Thank you very much for your question, EE. Question for James. Exodus 21:16 gives the death penalty for those who steal a man and sell him. Doesn't this show the Bible morally condemns what was black slavery?
Well, I mean, if it does, it's funny because no Christians realized it for the hundreds of years that they were practicing this. And you see the first iteration of black slavery was issued by a decree issued by the Pope, which authorized slavery to begin in Africa, consistent with the Old Testament, because it was Muslims who had invaded Spain and they were being enslaved. They were being subjugated by the Spanish, authorized to take slaves, similar to how the Hebrews would have taken slaves from war, defeated enemies. So that was one of the rationale. And when later on, when it was coming up the transatlantic slave trade, you would have the slave traders would go and they would buy the slaves. They didn't necessarily know where they came from. Were they war captives? Were they debt slaves? Hey, whatever, it doesn't matter. We're buying them from somebody. We're not the ones kidnapping them. We just assume that they were legally enslaved, because debt slavery was practiced in Africa. War slavery was practiced in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. So it was similar to what the Old Testament says, buying slaves from the nations around you. Doesn't mean you don't know whether someone was kidnapped or not. If all they had to do was say, I was kidnapped, then everybody would just say, oh, I'm not a real slave, I was kidnapped. That you would have to prove that. How would an African prove that they were kidnapped? They were not a debt slave. They were not a war slave. So that's why it persisted for a long time, and nobody saw a problem with it, consistent with the Bible, because they tried their best. These are not your modern non-dom Christians who just want to pretend they get to live forever. These are people who actually believed the Bible to be authoritative, and they believed that they were going to be judged by it. They wanted to do what they could to be as close to it as possible.
Thank you, James. Praise, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think this is an ironclad proof text that debunks any type of slavery at all. Because the word, if you get into like kidnapping and stuff, that they would be sort of like, it goes back into what we have modern day slavery of, people being taking by force. So this outlaws any force, which is basically chattel slavery. It means like like an impose or coercion or any type of servitude, and that was outlawed back then. And it's called trafficking. So any type of trafficking was outlawed in the Torah. So yeah, slavery debunked right there.
James, you get the last word.
No, you can buy slaves from the nations around you. These are not your brothers. They are treated differently and distinctly from your brothers, which is why the Christians would be indentured servitude. You could not enslave a Christian. You could only enslave someone who is a non-Christian. They would remain a slave, notwithstanding a conversion to Christianity later, because then all they would have to do is convert to. They would all just convert and be freed. No, it was the fact that they were not Christians, so they were allowed to be enslaved. They were allowed to be purchased from the nations around you, just like the Bible says.
Okay, thank you very much. We got another $10 super chat from Alyosha. And Praise, I think this is for you again, perhaps. Alyosha, thank you for the support. Praise, slavery or fairness in a country that lays debt on its grandchildren to the tune of $32 trillion, perhaps? You need to put things in perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you know what Alyosha is referring to here at all?
Not specifically. Is Alyosha, I mean, is he or she objecting to the fact that there was any type of like debt servitude? Like maybe that's what it's hard for me to really decipher what they're saying here. If they want to put in the chat, I'd be glad to, if they want to expound upon it more, you know. Maybe
yeah, that would be helpful, Alyosha, if you could
So I think what they're referring to is that the national debt, because everyone says debt is slavery. The national debt in the United States is probably $32 trillion. We're expending more money than we collect in taxes, and that is adding up year after year. And at some point, somebody's going to have to pay all that. So are we laying a burden of slavery on the future generation who will have to pay back our debt?
Oh, it looks like so CR family appreciate he's referring to her national debt, like you're saying. But Alyosha says, sorry, it was actually supposed to be for you, James, and you are responding, so that's good. So let me get it up on screen and pretend it says James and not Praise.
Right. No, I get it. And yeah, there is a big problem with the national debt and where we're spending money, where we're allocating money. That is a perfectly valid point. And we should probably fix that. We should probably stop adding so much debt. We should probably get our house in order. But that is a political question that is very hard to solve, because we've been trying to bat that issue around for decades now, and nothing ever seems to get done with it, because we just keep kicking that can down the road. Is it immoral? Yes, it is immoral, but we do it anyway because we're not perfect moral agents.
Okay, James, appreciate it. Praise, anything you'd like to add to that?
Not really. I think that was pretty much covered there.
Okay, let's see. Moving on to a question from Nakia Boyer. Appreciate it. At Donny, question for James. Deuteronomy 23:15-16 says, if a slave or servant leaves his master's house and comes to you, do not return him to his master. Let him stay in your midst and don't oppress him. What is immoral about that, James?
That specific verse is nothing immoral about that. Okay, but you have to understand the context of that verse was talking about foreign slaves who came from other lands, who were found in the land of Egypt, would not be returned to their owners. It was not talking about your neighbor's slave wandering off the property and coming to you and not being able to go back. Because if that were the case, because remember, under this system, debt is this inviolable thing. You cannot, the idea that they will not be paid back their debt is just the end of the world. So they've got to pay it back. But all they have to do is wander off, and then they don't have to continue labor. That's all they would do. Wouldn't be any point enslaving anybody, right? You're enslaving them to get the labor. This is not talking about the Hebrew slave who wanders off. This is talking about the foreign slave not being returned to a foreign nation.
Thank you, James. Praise. Anything you'd like to add?
No. It shows you that God provided asylum for escaped people from the nations, that He took care of them, and you can see if there was any type of bias of foreigners, it would have been there. But He gives them asylum. So they have a loving God. It was always that the Torah is predicated on love, and you can't show otherwise, because the commandments demonstrate it. And Jesus actually voiced that as well. And that is it there.
Thank you, Praise. James, yeah, go ahead. Last word.
Yeah, as I said before, sometimes the Bible has good things in it that are not objectionable. This looks like one of them. I can't really complain about it. Not oppressing a foreign slave, not returning them is good in my book.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. Moving on. What's the takeaway? Thank you for your question. Question for James. Would you rather be a slave in an ancient Jewish household or incarcerated in a max security prison? If the former, why? If the latter, why?
Well, I mean that's not an easy question to answer. I mean, I guess it depends on the household, right? If you look up the WPA slave narratives in this country, which is during the Great Depression, they sent people out because there were still people alive at that time who were slaves, and in the 1930s, and they had them tell their stories, tell us about slavery, how was it, what happened, and you can actually read those by state. I encourage people to do it, and they run the gamut. You had some slaves who said, actually, it wasn't that bad. We always had good food. The master was not cruel to us and everything. And then you had some accounts where the masters were terrible and just cruel and barbaric and horrible. And most of them were in the middle, where it was not terrible but not great. So I mean, it depends on where you're going to be enslaved. The difference would be that a maximum security inmate, that you're not in there to work, that you're in there because we need to protect society from you. That's the difference in prisoners. We are imprisoning you because you are a danger to society, and you would be a threat to hurt people if we allowed you to come out. It's a fundamentally different scenario versus somebody who just lapsed on a payment.
Thank you, James. Praise. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just think if you have, let's look at the example or an exemplar of what type of masters or what type of people were ahead of the Israelite servitude or Mosaic. And the Mosaic covenant was Abraham. He's like the perfect example. And he even gave all his belongings, house, everything to his foreign slaves. So, I mean, to me, that's incomparable with any other type of socioeconomic system anywhere, any moral system that's ever been, instituted. So I'll just end it there.
Quick final word, James?
No. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, Alyosha now has a couple super chats for you, James. So Alyosha, appreciate the support. And Alyosha says, James, you cannot have the human dignity without the incarnation. It's why the Greeks and Romans behaved the way they did. Any thoughts on that, James?
I mean, all ancient societies behaved in ways that we today would find. That's almost like a presentist fallacy that Praise mentioned. All ancient cultures had things today that we would find repugnant, and as future generations will for us. But the easiest way to get around that is that there is no incarnation, yet we do have human dignity. So you say we cannot, yet we do anyway. So obviously there's a error in your line of reasoning there. It's you're putting the cart before the horse.
Thank you, James. Alyosha's got another one. So this is an impromptu Alyosha versus James debate on slavery. So Alyosha says, point of order for James. We did not see a resurgence of slavery in the West until the Enlightenment fouled things up. Any thoughts, James?
I really don't know what they're talking about with that. Slavery in some form existed throughout time in history. I don't think there's ever been a time where it did not exist. Now, if you talk about the modern incarnation, the transatlantic slave trade, well, there were lots of factors that play into that. The discovery of America, the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, that's a whole different can of worms, and I don't even know where he's going with it. So,
okay, appreciate it, James. Super chat from Bubblegum Gun, appreciate it, and short and sweet. James, is slavery objectively morally bad or opinion?
opinion. I don't believe in objective morality. I don't make absolute or objective moral statements. It's my opinion that it's bad. If you disagree, tell me why.
Thank you, James. Praise, anything you'd like to add to anything said in the last couple questions and comments?
Yeah, I think we need to qualify what we mean by slavery. I think bubblegum's meaning like chattel slavery, like the antebellum slavery in the South. That type of slavery is objectively wrong, and we have evidence of that through the commandments of God. Those are objectively binding; they're eternally binding. So yes, I mean under the Christian purview, yes, that is wrong, but not as I mean, the universe doesn't endow you with morality. So yeah, they don't. So atheists and unbelievers, they have nothing to cling on to show that that's objectively binding bad. So yeah.
Thank you, Praise. James, you get the last word on that one.
No, you can move on.
Okay, appreciate it. Centurion. So as you can see, lots of questions have come in and comments. Lots of side chat debates, as is usual with these debates. So Centurion, thank you so much for the question there, brother. For James, since you claim God did not do it right, how would you do it differently to make it better than God?
I would put obligation on part of the lender to not make loans to people who are not going to be able to pay the loan back. It's pretty simple. The idea of just putting everything on the debtor, that somebody can just loan money to whoever, and if they can't pay, just enslave them. That's predatory. That encourages predatory lending, loan sharking. It's like mafia type tactics that we don't need. If you don't think your brother can pay a loan back, don't make a loan to him. If you decide to make a loan to him anyway, be prepared to take a loss on that.
Thank you, James. Praise, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's just one of the things I mentioned in the debate tonight, that the Bible outlaws any financial exploitation. Just read Exodus 22, 25 through 27. So that's just not there. I'll just end it there.
James?
Doesn't really go into elaborate detail about that, but I mean, yeah, exactly what that is and how far that goes. It really isn't a very robust regulatory scheme.
Okay, James, thank you so much. Mark Reed's got a question for Praise, the evolution debate titan. Mark's been here numerous times for debates on the flood, age of the earth, and evolution. Always fun. So now that I'm glancing at it, you may have answered this earlier, but if you got anything to add, now would be the time. So thanks for the question, Mark. Praise. Why does Exodus 21:7-11 say that a father can sell their daughter into slavery and they're not to be let go as a man is?
And I think I went into this with it earlier.
Yeah.
It's called a bride price. It's a mohar. It's a marriage gift. It has nothing to do really with servitude. Like there's no contracts involved. There's not even laboring involved. And that's why they would not go out as the others, just because of this bride price. And also, like, it kind of goes into the Targum. If you get the Targum, it says if the master failed to marry her as he promised, it was considered in breach of the contract, and the daughter was free to be redeemed by her family. The master had no right to retain her or sell her to recover the cost of the bride price. So this all has to do with the bride price. If you get to the Targum Jonathan, scholars, you can just read it there. Exodus 21:8-9. You can kind of go into that. I can give you citations if Mark wanted to give me more. If Mark wanted me to like go in deeper in that, I'll give him more citations. Just let me know, Mark, and I'll send it to your email or something like that.
Thank you, Praise. James, anything you'd like to add?
Right. So this concept, and like I realized it was pervasive throughout the time, the cultures, but this idea that daughters are a form of property, almost to be bartered and sold, auctioned to the highest bidder, so that they can be sold perhaps even into concubinage, to the point where they could be sold to be, for lack of a better term, a CM dumpster for a rich guy who can have lots of concubines and wives, and that's their station in life, because they can but at least they'll have a roof over their head, they'll have food to eat. So hey, I guess it could be worse, but I wouldn't want I don't have a daughter, but if I did have a daughter, that is not the fate that I would want for them.
Okay, thank you, James. Praise. Over to you. But before you do, I'm just looking. Oh, never mind. I did see the. So it's a follow up from Mark. Mark, appreciate the super chat. Chat is moving quickly, so almost missed it. Apologies, but I got it just in time. Again, thanks so much for the support, Mark. And this is a follow up question. Praise. Or let me see. How come it says that a girl sold under Exodus says if the slave owners arrange for her to marry his son, why is the sale a dowry? But just 1 second, because he sent in a follow-up that I want to get on screen. So he says this, he's coming at you, Praise, little mini Praise versus Mark Reed debate. Not a bride price is his objection. The verse gives the option to marry after the girl has been sold. How do you respond, Praise?
Well, we have the Targum Jonathan that actually says bride price. Yeah, so that's just patently false. I'm sorry, Mark. I don't know where you get your information from. It's definitely not a dowry. But if you read the, I have what I use for my translation is the Net translation, and it says in verse 9, if he has selected her for his son, he is to treat her according to as a daughter. So I don't even see the translation that he has. I don't even have that. So the web translation, it says, if he marries her to her son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. That's the translation that I have. So I'd be interested to see what translation he's referring to.
Thank you, Praise. James, you want to anything to respond?
No, thank you.
Okay. Moving on. That was fun. Appreciate it, Mark Reed. And let's see. We're at the 30-minute mark now for the questions section. Time has just flown by in this debate overall. So let's start wrapping it up with one or two more questions. Here's one that comes in.
Fun.
Are you having fun, James?
Yeah.
Good. Isaac Unruh, thank you for the question. Question for both. If the slaves or indentured servants were fed, clothed, and housed, how does that differ from a working individual in the present day? Why don't we start with Praise? Praise. Oh.
I'm just trying to respond to Mark too here because he's wrong. But okay,
thought you were raptured for a second, Praise.
How does that differ from working individuals?
Getting ripped again.
Yeah, I mean, this is what scholars like Jay Sklar mentioned, that this is no different than, let's say, professional sports, where they're trading around contracts, shifting around players. There's owners and players and things like that. It's no different than present day. So I don't know where the moral outrage comes from. I just think it's because the Bible, it for some reason it causes people to get all up in arms and stuff, and it triggers them. So I don't know. Maybe it's just the Bible that brings it.
Okay, thank you. And James, over to you. Floor is yours.
So the fact that you could draw lots of parallels to slavery and modern day capitalism is not mean that slavery is okay. It's, if anything, an indictment on the current system that we have. The fact that there are so many parallels and similarities, that we have not reached a state of perfection, but we are certainly better off than we were 200 years ago, and we will be better off in the future.
Okay, thank you, James. Question from Taylor K. I think you kind of answered this earlier. Correct me if I'm wrong, James, but she's asking.
I'll just hit
question
on
for
it,
James.
Yeah.
What objective standard do you use to judge the morality of slavery? You were pointing to subjective morality, I believe, earlier, or however you'd like to respond.
Yeah, I don't have an objective standard, Taylor. Being a moral relativist, I evaluate moral questions and I form opinions and views, and that's all that I have. That's all that any of us have. And by the way, even if your God is real, it wouldn't make it objective. He would just have his opinions on morality and we would have ours. The only difference is he's got the bigger stick. He can impose his will on us. We can't do that to him, but wouldn't make it objective.
Thank you, James. Echoing Erudite has a follow-up question. Thank you so much. And he's asking, James, if you don't believe in objective morals, then why do you have a problem with a master beating his slaves?
I consider it to be an unnecessary act of cruelty. It doesn't have to be objective, because obviously the master doing it doesn't think that it's unnecessarily cruel. He obviously thinks he has justification for it. I would disagree. There's no way you can physically say which of us is right or wrong. That's why it's not objective. I would just say, I don't think it's moral. I don't think he should be allowed to do it. Therefore, I will stop him from being able to do it.
Okay, thank you, James. Praise, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, if you get into philosophy, it gets a lot worse for the moral subjectivists. And because it actually, if you get into the idea that there are no moral truths or falsities, and that's really the position that James is adhering to. And that means that you not only not any type, not only do you not, let's say, like put some type of injunction against it, but you actually promote it on some level. And that's without some type of objective moral standard to give some type of moral conviction against that. I mean, I forgot the name. It's like moral non-cognitivism. So this moral subjectivism, it really does reduce into moral non-cognitivism. So look, I hope people look that up, and it's really problematic because like the Holocaust becomes not even a moral truth. I mean, being wrong. It's just I mean, it's just something that happens. We accept it. So it's terrible. The secular, I would say, moral systems are terrible.
Appreciate it, Praise. James, you want a final word?
It is what it is. I mean, there is no objective moral standard. What we are doing is you're just pretending that there is, and pretending to impose that. But there just is nothing. All we have is opinions. And when we reach a consensus, when enough people share that opinion, we get to impose that opinion on others. They don't have to agree with it. It doesn't matter. We will force them to comply with it. That's how societies are governed.
All right. Next, here's another comment from Alyosha. Again, I really appreciate all the support. You guys are the life and blood of this channel. And so Alyosha has a comment to you now, James. He says, all of your legal ideas of fairness came directly from the scholastics and reformers sussing out the legal science of the West. It wasn't an evolving process. We Christians own it. Do you have any thoughts on that, James?
Well, I mean, it's part of the fact that pretty much everybody was a Christian until recently, especially in the West. So, but they didn't use Christianity to arrive at these truths. Christianity had been around for 2,000 years. Slavery had existed through almost that entire period. Nobody saw anything wrong with it until it became to the point where it wasn't an economic necessity anymore. Then we were able to actually realize the cruelty, the inherent cruelty and depravity that was there the whole time that nobody noticed.
Okay, James, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap it up there. We did get some overtime in the audience Q&A, but we do have to wrap it up somewhere. So that was a ton of fun. I really appreciate everybody's well thought out questions, but also the follow-up questions that went along with them too. Kept it fun. And I always enjoy these audience question and answer periods. So Praise and James, thank you both for giving us your time for this important debate on the question, is biblical slavery morally good? Gentlemen, I want to give
Donny. Thank you, Praise.
Thank you, James and SOT. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, guys.
My pleasure. James, final words and final thoughts from you?
We're going to be having an after show on the Amy Newman channel, so you can come over, talk about the debate, let us know what you think, and it'll be open mic. I know Praise is having an after show, but otherwise he's welcome to come on there and tell us why we're wrong.
All right. The debate continues. 2 after shows, one over on Amy Newman and your channel. and one over on Praise's channel. So please check those out. The relevant links to our debaters tonight are in the description box for people to check out. So again, to the debaters, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to having you both on in the future for some 2023 debates. I'll keep you both busy. So with that, I'm going to let you gentlemen out for the night. And I am just going to stick around for just a few minutes here and go over a couple reminders. I briefly touched on some upcoming shows earlier during the break section, but I do want to recommend that people check out the upcoming live stream section. I just set another 7 events. And so we are doing our best here to top 2022 in 2023. I've also set now another 4 evolution debates in the Evolution Debate Challenge series. And so if you're an evolutionist and you now want to take the 2022 to 2023 Evolution Debate Challenge series, please do email me, standingfortruthministries.com, and I'll fit you in. Okay, so tomorrow we're back here, 6 EST, and I'm really looking forward to this. Dr. Grady McMurtry, he's been a blessing, very knowledgeable on so many different topics. He's well-rounded. As a matter of fact, about 4 years ago, when we first started this channel and I started doing interviews back in the Google Hangout days, so StreamYard wasn't even available then, Dr. McMurtry was one of my first interviews. And it was a ton of fun. This will be his 3rd time here. So guys, this is just going to be a 2-hour Q&A show. And so it's going to be live. It's going to be interactive. So make sure you're here tomorrow in the chat. You can also shoot me questions over Facebook or email. The Bible, age of the earth, the flood, creation, evolution, whatever you want to ask a question on, or even just provide a criticism, a challenge, an objection, whatever it is, send it in. And we're going to have a solid 2 hours of Q&A. I'll be having a discussion here soon. I believe we're doing it Saturday night. So with all the events and debates we got on the channel, I've got a few of my own debates that I've been preparing for, discussions more so as well. And so I'm finding it harder and harder to squeeze them in light of all the content we have. So again, this one is basically set with me and Chris, but we're just deciding what's going to be the best day or night. What we'll probably do is Saturday night, we have a debate between Neff Film Free and Ryan Adler on dinosaurs. And Chris and I may do this discussion sometime after that. So we'll see. Then on Monday, I've got Dr. Dan Biddle back with me here for a presentation and then audience Q&A. This will be on dinosaurs, man, creation, and the flood. Dan, his ministry is a blessing. They're doing great work for the Lord. And he's been here 2 times before, once on the flood and then once on human evolution in general. And so if you haven't seen those shows, please do check it out. Echoing Erudite says this was a fun debate. I agree. Very important topic. I'd like to get more debates on this topic, as a matter of fact. So those interested, please do reach out. And he says he got a bonus question too. Yes. We get a ton of questions per debate. And so we really could do 3-4 hour Q&As. And so I do my best to sort through them. Some more interesting debates. Paul Price. He's doing great work. He's done great work. He's been here years ago, did a genetic entropy debate. He's written extensively on genetic entropy in the Creation Ministries website. And so he'll be here under his channel name, Uncensored Pilgrims. He'll be debating Snake Was Right. Snake Was Right and Kent. They'll be going at it again in February on Does Biology Support Evolution? Paul Price is going to join me at the end of this month as well, refuting liberal scholarship on Behemoth. I'm pumped for this one. Very important discussion to have. And lots in the world of soteriology. We've got Charles Jennings and Dan Chapa debating the book of Hebrews and the warning passages, specifically Hebrews 10, Hebrews 6. I'm exceptionally pumped for this one. Pastor Matt First, Pastor Anthony Aquino, who are God's true chosen people. So we've got a dispensationalism debate. We've done a few of these now, and I think I'm addicted to debates on that topic. Then we've got Caleb Percher and Nick Sayers. Is the King James Version reading of 1 John 5:7 correct? And so that'll be next month as well. And again, as I've let you guys know, we've got several in the Evolution Debate Challenge series, now 2023. So Kent versus Fox Official, Kent versus Christian Dean, Kent versus Snake Was Right, and Kent versus David Emery. And so if you're interested in debating the evolution topic, again, please do make sure to reach out, standingfortruthministries.com, and I'll do my best to fit you in. So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Blessed be he. Appreciate it. If you're a debate addict, then I highly recommend going into the main channel section, go under playlists, and find the playlist titled Debates Hosted by Standing for Truth Ministries. And you'll find about 270 debates now that we've hosted on all sorts of topics. Soteriology, nature of God. We've done quite a few debates on the Trinity versus oneness topic. Eschatology, creation versus evolution, of course. Debates on slavery, eschatology, morality, atheism in general. And so, for everybody, you'll basically find a debate topic that I'm sure that it interests you. Doki Doki Bible Club, thank you so much for that. As a matter of fact, real quick before I shut it down, I'm going to get my website open here and just give you a real quick. Actually, if you're not yet subscribed to our secondary channel, it's titled Young Earth Creation. What I've been doing is re-premiering a lot of our past debates, especially on creation evolution. For the most part, that's what the secondary channel focuses on. And so one of our videos on that channel went viral a couple of years ago. It's got 1.5 million views or so. And so that channel's got a lot of viewers that aren't necessarily regular viewers here. So it's always nice to re-upload to that channel. And again, that channel is called Young Earth Creation. Echoing says, Donny, you got the best debate channel on YouTube. Well, I appreciate it. I'm definitely determined and motivated to give you guys the best debates on all topics, and also just spoil you with, 4 or 5 debates a week. It helps that I'm also a debate addict. So here's our website, guys, standingfortruthministries.com. Here's a really quick walkthrough, because I do get a lot of questions that come in pertaining to specific topics that you can find on our website and also just on the channels themselves. So I am in the midst of updating this as well. I've got a lot of content over the last 2 months that I need to get onto the website. But anyways, if you go to the website, right on the front, you've got our main channel here. Here's the Young Earth Creation secondary channel here. You can access the patron website here, Creationist Clothing. So if you like the SFT gear, everybody always teases me for my blue shirt. Well, this says SFT on it. And so you can I've got a bunch of these shirts, and you can get those shirts on creationistclothing.com. You can get all kinds of cool SFT gear. But right on the main page, we've got a lot for you. The SFT podcast. So if you go to our podcast page, you can find easily over 100 now, I think, that have been uploaded, edited, and uploaded in podcast form. Google, Apple, Spotify, all the cool apps. And so on the front page as well, you can get quite a bit. Neanderthals here, examining human evolution, mammoths with Mike Ord, lecture I gave on Kent Hovind Official on endogenous retroviruses, an interview I did over on Christopher Cernicke's channel, excellent channel. He's putting on some good interviews. So my testimony, and just a lot of the books that we sell. And so these 3 books here, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, I would say these are probably the best sellers and also the books that I get the most questions on. And so the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, these links will take you right to the black and white edition and then also the full color. End Times Theology, Dawn of the Antichrist, of course, very popular topic. And on all the books that I've written, I've also done formal debates on defending my arguments, basically. So I've done several formal debates on ERVs. I've done several debates on the End Times Theology topic. Here's one of them, the Great Rapture debate. Special Creation, Updated and Expanded. Tons of information there on all sorts of ancestry-related topics. Here's a debate I did on ERVs, our 2022 Defending Genesis conference. You just keep going down. We got tons of material here. Over here, your most commonly asked questions. What are Neanderthals? What about endogenous retroviruses? What about human evolution? Limestone? Heat problem, mammal-like reptiles, pseudogenes. So I'd be surprised if there's not at least one answer to whatever question one would have. And that's just the beginning of it. If you go to the video section, I've got everything broken down in categories. So you got everything from ancestry to origin of life to radiometric dating to our evolution debate challenge, Trinity debates, End Times Theology. If you haven't yet seen our Defending Genesis conference in 2022, it was comprehensive. We had a lot of great guests. We had, I believe it was about 10 shows, including a debate that we had. And so we focused on isochron dating, countering compromise, dinosaurs in the geologic column, evidence for the worldwide flood. And so the website is a great place to go to and just really utilize it, because you're going to find a lot of content. Also, if you go to my Patreon page, what I've been doing over the last month is basically putting out articles, very extensive articles. So right here, you'll see an article refuting nested hierarchies, and I attach a downloadable PDF. And so I always recommend downloading the PDF to my articles because you get the preferred format. Patreon doesn't really give you all of that many options. But nonetheless, it's still a good read over Patreon. So here's an article I just put out here. Article on preterism. Article on Daniel 12:1. And so you can find lots of stuff over on the Patreon page as well. And so that's basically it for a brief walkthrough. And okay, that'll be it. Just looking at some of these comments. You guys always keep things fun and lighthearted. Okay, guys, so we'll see you tomorrow, 6 o'clock EST with Dr. Grady McMurtry. Skeptics, non-skeptics, make sure you are here bright and early for that show and bring your questions. So with that, God bless all.